The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, read by Graham Redman. Chapter 11. When the last of the guests had driven away, I went back into the inner hall, and found Samuel at the side table, presiding over the brandy and soda water. My lady and Miss Rachel came out of the drawing-room, followed by the two gentlemen. Mr. Godfrey had some brandy and soda water, Mr. Franklin took nothing. He sat down looking dead tired. The talking on this birthday occasion had, I suppose, been too much for him. My lady, turning round to wish them good night, looked hard at the wicked Colonel's legacy shining in her daughter's dress. "Rachel," she asked, "where are you going to put your diamond tonight?" Miss Rachel was in high good spirits, just in that humour for talking nonsense, and perversely persisting in it as if it was sense, which you may sometimes have observed in young girls when they are highly wrought up at the end of an exciting day. First, she declared she didn't know where to put the diamond. Then she said, on her dressing-table, of course, along with her other things. Then she remembered that the diamond might take to shining of itself with its awful moony light in the dark, and that would terrify her in the dead of night. Then she bethought herself of an Indian cabinet which stood in her sitting-room, and instantly made up her mind to put the Indian diamond in the Indian cabinet for the purpose of permitting two beautiful native productions to admire each other. Having let her little flow of nonsense run on as far as that point, her mother interposed and stopped her. "My dear, your Indian cabinet has no lock to it," says my lady. "Good heavens, mamma!" cried Miss Rachel. "Is this an hotel? Are there thieves in the house?" Without taking notice of this fantastic way of talking, my lady wished the gentleman good night. She next turned to Miss Rachel and kissed her. "Why not let me keep the diamond for you tonight?" she asked. Miss Rachel received that proposal as she might 10 years since have received a proposal to part her from a new doll. My lady saw there was no reasoning with her that night. "Come into my room, Rachel, the first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "I shall have something to say to you." With those last words she left us slowly, thinking her own thoughts and, to all appearance, not best pleased with the way by which they were leading her. Miss Rachel was the next to say good night. She shook hands first with Mr. Godfrey, who was standing at the other end of the hall looking at a picture. Then she turned back to Mr. Franklin, still sitting weary and silent in a corner. What words passed between them I can't say, but standing near the old oak frame which holds our large looking-glass, I saw her reflected in it, slyly slipping the locket which Mr. Franklin had given to her out of the bosom of her dress and showing it to him for a moment with a smile, which certainly meant something out of the common, before she tripped off to bed. This incident staggered me a little in the reliance I had previously felt on my own judgment. I began to think that Penelope might be right about the state of her young lady's affections after all. As soon as Miss Rachel left him eyes to see with, Mr. Franklin noticed me. His variable humour, shifting about everything, had shifted about the Indians already. "Betteridge," he said, "I'm half inclined to think I took Mr. Murthwaite too seriously when we had that talk in the shrubbery. I wonder whether he has been trying any of his traveller's tales on us. Do you really mean to let the dogs loose?" "I'll relieve them of their collars, sir," I answered, "and leave them free to take a turn in the night if they smell a reason for it." "All right," says Mr. Franklin, "we'll see what is to be done tomorrow. I am not at all disposed to alarm my aunt, Betteridge, without a very pressing reason for it. Good night." He looked so worn and pale as he nodded to me and took his candle to go upstairs that I ventured to advise his having a drop of brandy and water by way of nightcap. Mr. Godfrey, walking towards us from the other end of the hall, backed me. He pressed Mr. Franklin in the friendliest manner to take something before he went to bed. I only note these trifling circumstances because, after all I had seen and heard that day, it pleased me to observe that our two gentlemen were on just as good terms as ever. Their warfare of words, heard by Penelope in the drawing-room, and their rivalry for the best place in Miss Rachel's good graces seemed to have set no serious difference between them. But there, they were both good-tempered and both men of the world, and there is certainly this merit in people of station, that they are not nearly so quarrelsome among each other as people of no station at all. Mr. Franklin declined the brandy and water, and went upstairs with Mr. Godfrey, their rooms being next door to each other. On the landing, however, either his cousin persuaded him, or he veered about and changed his mind as usual. "Perhaps I may want it in the night," he called down to me. "Send up some brandy and water into my room." I sent up Samuel with the brandy and water, and then went out and unbuckled the dogs' collars. They both lost their heads with astonishment on being set loose at that time of night, and jumped upon me like a couple of puppies. However, the rain soon cooled them down again. They lapped a drop of water each, and crept back into their kennels. As I went into the house I noticed signs in the sky which betokened a break in the weather for the better. For the present it still poured heavily, and the ground was in a perfect sop. Samuel and I went all over the house, and shut up as usual. I examined everything myself, and trusted nothing to my deputy on this occasion. All was safe and fast when I rested my old bones in bed between midnight and 1 in the morning. The worries of the day had been a little too much for me, I suppose. At any rate, I had a touch of Mr. Franklin's malady that night. It was sunrise before I fell off at last into a sleep. All the time I lay awake the house was as quiet as the grave. Not a sound stirred but the splash of the rain and the sighing of the wind among the trees as a breeze sprang up with the morning. About 7:30 I woke, and opened my window on a fine sunshiny day. The clock had struck 8, and I was just going out to chain up the dogs again, when I heard a sudden whisking of petticoats on the stairs behind me. I turned about, and there was Penelope flying down after me like mad. "Father," she screamed, "come upstairs, for God's sake! The diamond is gone!" "Are you out of your mind?" I asked her. "Gone," said Penelope, "gone, nobody knows how. Come up and see." She dragged me after her into our young lady's sitting-room, which opened into her bedroom. There, on the threshold of her bedroom door, stood Miss Rachel, almost as white in the face as the white dressing-gown that clothed her. There also stood the 2 doors of the Indian cabinet, wide open. One of the drawers inside was pulled out as far as it would go. "Look," says Penelope, "I myself saw Miss Rachel put the diamond into that drawer last night." I went to the cabinet. The drawer was empty. "Is this true, miss?" I asked. With a look that was not like herself, with a voice that was not like her own, Miss Rachel answered, as my daughter had answered, "The diamond is gone." Having said those words, she withdrew into her bedroom and shut and locked the door. Before we knew which way to turn next, my lady came in, hearing my voice in her daughter's sitting-room, and wondering what had happened. The news of the loss of the diamond seemed to petrify her. She went straight to Miss Rachel's bedroom, and insisted on being admitted. Miss Rachel let her in. The alarm, running through the house like fire, caught the 2 gentlemen next. Mr. Godfrey was the first to come out of his room. All he did when he heard what had happened was to hold up his hands in a state of bewilderment, which didn't say much for his natural strength of mind. Mr. Franklin, whose clear head I had confidently counted on to advise us, seemed to be as helpless as his cousin when he heard the news in his turn. For a wonder, he had had a good night's rest at last, and the unaccustomed luxury of sleep had, as he said himself, apparently stupefied him. However, when he had swallowed his cup of coffee, which he always took on the foreign plan some hours before he ate any breakfast, his brains brightened. The clear-headed side of him turned up, and he took the matter in hand resolutely and cleverly, much as follows. He first sent for the servants, and told them to leave all the lower doors and windows, with the exception of the front door which I had opened, exactly as they had been left when we locked up overnight. He next proposed to his cousin and to me to make quite sure, before we took any further steps, that the diamond had not accidentally dropped somewhere out of sight, say at the back of the cabinet, or down behind the table on which the cabinet stood. Having searched in both places and found nothing, having also questioned Penelope and discovered from her no more than the little she had already told me, Mr. Franklin suggested next extending our inquiries to Miss Rachel, and sent Penelope to knock at her bedroom door. My lady answered the knock, and closed the door behind her. The moment after we heard it locked inside by Miss Rachel. My mistress came out among us, looking sorely puzzled and distressed. "The loss of the diamond seems to have quite overwhelmed Rachel," she said in reply to Mr. Franklin. "She shrinks in the strangest manner from speaking of it, even to me. It is impossible you can see her for the present." Having added to our perplexities by this account of Miss Rachel, my lady, after a little effort, recovered her usual composure, and acted with her usual decision. "I suppose there is no help for it," she said quietly. "I suppose I have no alternative but to send for the police." "And the first thing for the police to do," added Mr. Franklin, catching her up, "is to lay hands on the Indian jugglers who performed here last night." My lady and Mr. Godfrey, not knowing what Mr. Franklin and I knew, both started, and both looked surprised. "I can't stop to explain myself now," Mr. Franklin went on. "I can only tell you that the Indians have certainly stolen the diamond. Give me a letter of introduction," says he, addressing my lady, "to one of the magistrates at Frizinghall, merely telling him that I represent your interests and wishes, and let me ride off with it instantly. Our chance of catching the thieves may depend on our not wasting one unnecessary minute." Nota bene, whether it was the French side or the English, the right side of Mr. Franklin seemed to be uppermost now. The only question was, how long would it last? He put pen, ink, and paper before his aunt, who, as it appeared to me, wrote the letter he wanted a little unwillingly. If it had been possible to overlook such an event as the loss of a jewel worth £20,000, I believe, with my lady's opinion of her late brother, and her distrust of his birthday gift, it would have been privately a relief to her to let the thieves get off with the Moonstone scot-free. I went out with Mr. Franklin to the stables, and took the opportunity of asking him how the Indians, whom I suspected, of course, as shrewdly as he did, could possibly have got into the house. "One of them might have slipped into the hall in the confusion when the dinner company were going away," says Mr. Franklin. "The fellow may have been under the sofa while my aunt and Rachel were talking about where the diamond was to be put for the night. He would only have to wait till the house was quiet, and there it would be in the cabinet to be had for the taking." With those words he called to the groom to open the gate, and galloped off. This seemed certainly to be the only rational explanation, but how had the thief contrived to make his escape from the house? I had found the front door locked and bolted as I had left it at night, when I went to open it after getting up. As for the other doors and windows, there they were still, all safe and fast, to speak for themselves. The dogs too? Suppose the thief had got away by dropping from one of the upper windows, how had he escaped the dogs? Had he come provided for them with drugged meat? As the doubt crossed my mind, the dogs themselves came galloping at me round a corner, rolling each other over on the wet grass in such lively health and spirits that it was with no small difficulty I brought them to reason, and chained them up again. The more I turned it over in my mind, the less satisfactory Mr. Franklin's explanation appeared to be. We had our breakfasts. Whatever happens in a house, robbery or murder, it doesn't matter, you must have your breakfast. When we had done, my lady sent for me, and I found myself compelled to tell her all that I had hitherto concealed relating to the Indians and their plot. Being a woman of a high courage, she soon got over the first startling effect of what I had to communicate. Her mind seemed to be far more perturbed about her daughter than about the heathen rogues and their conspiracy. "You know how odd Rachel is, and how differently she behaves sometimes from other girls," my lady said to me. "But I have never in all my experience seen her so strange and so reserved as she is now. The loss of her jewel seems almost to have turned her brain. Who would have thought that horrible diamond could have laid such a hold on her in so short a time?" It was certainly strange. Taking toys and trinkets in general, Miss Rachel was nothing like so mad after them as most young girls. Yet there she was, still locked up inconsolably in her bedroom. It is but fair to add that she was not the only one of us in the house who was thrown out of the regular groove. Mr. Godfrey, for instance, though professionally a sort of consoler general, seemed to be at a loss where to look for his own resources. Having no company to amuse him, and getting no chance of trying what his experience of women in distress could do towards comforting Miss Rachel, he wandered hither and thither about the house and gardens in an aimless, uneasy way. He was in two different minds about what it became him to do after the misfortune that had happened to us. Ought he to relieve the family, in their present situation, of the responsibility of him as a guest, or ought he to stay on the chance that even his humble services might be of some use? He decided ultimately that the last course was perhaps the most customary and considerate course to take in such a very peculiar case of family distress as this was. Circumstances try the metal a man is really made of. Mr. Godfrey, tried by circumstances, showed himself of weaker metal than I had thought him to be. As for the women servants, excepting Rosanna Spearman, who kept by herself, they took to whispering together in corners and staring at nothing suspiciously, as is the manner of that weaker half of the human family when anything extraordinary happens in a house. I myself acknowledge to have been fidgety and ill-tempered. The cursed Moonstone had turned us all upside down. A little before 11 Mr. Franklin came back. The resolute side of him had, to all appearance, given way in the interval since his departure, under the stress that had been laid on it. He had left us at a gallop, he came back to us at a walk. When he went away he was made of iron, when he returned he was stuffed with cotton as limp could be. "Well," says my lady, "are the police coming?" "Yes," says Mr. Franklin, "they said they would follow me in a fly. Superintendent Seagrave, of your local police force, and 2 of his men. A mere form. The case is hopeless." "What? Have the Indians escaped, sir?" I asked. "The poor ill-used Indians have been most unjustly put in prison," says Mr. Franklin. "They are as innocent as the babe unborn. My idea that one of them was hidden in the house has ended, like all the rest of my ideas, in smoke. It's been proved," says Mr. Franklin, dwelling with great relish on his own incapacity, "to be simply impossible." After astonishing us by announcing this totally new turn in the matter of the Moonstone, our young gentleman, at his aunt's request, took a seat and explained himself. It appeared that the resolute side of him had held out as far as Frizinghall. He had put the whole case plainly before the magistrate, and the magistrate had at once sent for the police. The first inquiries instituted about the Indians showed that they had not so much as attempted to leave the town. Further questions addressed to the police proved that all three had been seen returning to Frising Hall with their boy on the previous night between 10 and 11, which, regard being had to hours and distances, also proved that they had walked straight back after performing on our terrace. Later still, at midnight, the police, having occasion to search the common lodging-house where they lived, had seen them all three again, and their little boy with them as usual. Soon after midnight I myself had safely shut up the house. Plainer evidence than this in favour of the Indians there could not well be. The magistrate said there was not even a case of suspicion against them so far, but as it was just possible, when the police came to investigate the matter, that discoveries affecting the jugglers might be made, he would contrive, by committing them as rogues and vagabonds, to keep them at our disposal under lock and key for a week. They had ignorantly done something, I forget what, in the town, which barely brought them within the operation of the law. Every human institution, justice included, will stretch a little if you only pull it the right way. The worthy magistrate was an old friend of my lady's, and the Indians were committed for a week as soon as the court opened that morning. Such was Mr. Franklin's narrative of events at Frising Hall. The Indian clue to the mystery of the lost jewel was now, to all appearance, a clue that had broken in our hands. If the jugglers were innocent, who in the name of wonder had taken the Moonstone out of Miss Rachel's drawer? 10 minutes later, to our infinite relief, Superintendent Seagrave arrived at the house. He reported passing Mr. Franklin on the terrace, sitting in the sun, I suppose with the Italian side of him uppermost, and warning the police as they went by that the investigation was hopeless before the investigation had begun. For a family in our situation, the superintendent of the Frising Hall police was the most comforting officer you could wish to see. Mr. Seagrave was tall and portly, and military in his manners. He had a fine commanding voice, and a mighty resolute eye, and a grand frock-coat which buttoned beautifully up to his leather stock. "I'm the man you want," was written all over his face, and he ordered his 2 inferior policemen about with a severity which convinced us all that there was no trifling with him. He began by going round the premises, outside and in, the result of that investigation proving to him that no thieves had broken in upon us from outside, and that the robbery consequently must have been committed by some person in the house. I leave you to imagine the state the servants were in when this official announcement first reached their ears. The superintendent decided to begin by examining the boudoir, and, that done, to examine the servants next. At the same time he posted one of his men on the staircase, which led to the servants' bedrooms, with instructions to let nobody in the house pass him till further orders. At this latter proceeding the weaker half of the human family went distracted on the spot. They bounced out of their corners, whisked upstairs in a body to Miss Rachel's room, Rosanna Spearman being carried away among them this time, burst in on Superintendent Seagrave, and, all looking equally guilty, summoned him to say which of them he suspected at once. Mr. Superintendent proved equal to the occasion. He looked at them with his resolute eye, and he cowed them with his military voice. "Now then, you women, go downstairs again, every one of you. I won't have you here. Look," says Mr. Superintendent, suddenly pointing to a little smear of the decorative painting on Miss Rachel's door, at the outer edge just under the lock. "Look what mischief the petticoats of some of you have done already. Clear out! Clear out!" Rosanna Spearman, who was nearest to him and nearest to the little smear on the door, set the example of obedience and slipped off instantly to her work. The rest followed her out. The superintendent finished his examination of the room, and, making nothing of it, asked me who had first discovered the robbery. My daughter had first discovered it. My daughter was sent for. Mr. Superintendent proved to be a little too sharp with Penelope at starting. "Now, young woman, attend to me, and mind you speak the truth." Penelope fired up instantly. "I've never been taught to tell lies, Mr. Policeman, and if father can stand there and hear me accused of falsehood and thieving, and my own bedroom shut against me, and my character taken away, which is all a poor girl has left, he's not the good father I take him for." A timely word from me put Justice and Penelope on a pleasanter footing together. The questions and answers went swimmingly, and ended in nothing worth mentioning. My daughter had seen Miss Rachel put the diamond in the drawer of the cabinet the last thing at night. She had gone in with Miss Rachel's cup of tea at 8 the next morning, and had found the drawer open and empty. Upon that she had alarmed the house, and there was an end of Penelope's evidence. Mr. Superintendent next asked to see Miss Rachel herself. Penelope mentioned his request through the door. The answer reached us by the same road. "I have nothing to tell the policeman. I can't see anybody." Our experienced officer looked equally surprised and offended when he heard that reply. I told him my young lady was ill, and begged him to wait a little and see her later. We thereupon went downstairs again, and were met by Mr. Godfrey and Mr. Franklin crossing the hall. The two gentlemen, being inmates of the house, were summoned to say if they could throw any light on the matter. Neither of them knew anything about it. Had they heard any suspicious noises during the previous night? They had heard nothing but the pattering of the rain. Had I, lying awake longer than either of them, heard nothing either? Nothing. Released from examination, Mr. Franklin, still sticking to the helpless view of our difficulty, whispered to me, "That man will be of no earthly use to us. Superintendent Seagrave is an ass." Released in his turn, Mr. Godfrey whispered to me, "Evidently a most competent person. Betteridge, I have the greatest faith in him." Many men, many opinions, as one of the ancients said before my time. Mr. Superintendent's next proceeding took him back to the boudoir again, with my daughter and me at his heels. His object was to discover whether any of the furniture had been moved during the night out of its customary place, his previous investigation in the room having apparently not gone quite far enough to satisfy his mind on this point. While we were still poking about among the chairs and tables, the door of the bedroom was suddenly opened. After having denied herself to everybody, Miss Rachel, to our astonishment, walked into the midst of us of her own accord. She took up her garden hat from a chair, and then went straight to Penelope with this question: "Mr. Franklin Blake sent you with a message to me this morning?" "Yes, miss." "He wished to speak to me, didn't he?" "Yes, miss." "Where is he now?" Hearing voices on the terrace below, I looked out of window and saw the two gentlemen walking up and down together. Answering for my daughter, I said, "Mr. Franklin is on the terrace, miss." Without another word, without heeding Mr. Superintendent, who tried to speak to her, pale as death and wrapped up strangely in her own thoughts, she left the room and went down to her cousins on the terrace. It showed a want of due respect, it showed a breach of good manners on my part, but for the life of me I couldn't help looking out of window when Miss Rachel met the gentleman outside. She went up to Mr. Franklin without appearing to notice Mr. Godfrey, who thereupon drew back and left them by themselves. What she said to Mr. Franklin appeared to be spoken vehemently. It lasted but for a short time, and, judging by what I saw of his face from the window, seemed to astonish him beyond all power of expression. While they were still together, my lady appeared on the terrace. Miss Rachel saw her, said a few last words to Mr. Franklin, and suddenly went back into the house again before her mother came up with her. My lady, surprised herself, and noticing Mr. Franklin's surprise, spoke to him. Mr. Godfrey joined them, and spoke also. Mr. Franklin walked away a little between the two, telling them what had happened, I suppose, for they both stopped short after taking a few steps, like persons struck with amazement. I had just seen as much as this when the door of the sitting-room was opened violently. Miss Rachel walked swiftly through to her bedroom, wild and angry, with fierce eyes and flaming cheeks. Mr. Superintendent once more attempted to question her. She turned round on him at her bedroom door. "I have not sent for you," she cried out vehemently. "I don't want you. My diamond is lost. Neither you nor anybody else will ever find it." With those words she went in and locked the door in our faces. Penelope, standing nearest to it, heard her burst out crying the moment she was alone again. In a rage one moment, in tears the next. What did it mean? I told the superintendent it meant that Miss Rachel's temper was upset by the loss of her jewel. Being anxious for the honour of the family, it distressed me to see my young lady forget herself even with a police officer, and I made the best excuse I could accordingly. In my own private mind I was more puzzled by Miss Rachel's extraordinary language and conduct than words can tell. Taking what she had said at her bedroom door as a guide to guess by, I could only conclude that she was mortally offended by our sending for the police, and that Mr. Franklin's astonishment on the terrace was caused by her having expressed herself to him, as the person chiefly instrumental in fetching the police, to that effect. If this guess was right, why, having lost her diamond, should she object to the presence in the house of the very people whose business it was to recover it for her? And how, in heaven's name, could she know that the Moonstone would never be found again? As things stood, at present no answer to those questions was to be hoped for from anybody in the house. Mr. Franklin appeared to think it a point of honour to forbear repeating to a servant, even to so old a servant as I was, what Miss Rachel had said to him on the terrace. Mr. Godfrey, who, as a gentleman and a relative, had been probably admitted into Mr. Franklin's confidence, respected that confidence as he was bound to do. My lady, who was also in the secret, no doubt, and who alone had access to Miss Rachel, owned openly that she could make nothing of her. "You madden me when you talk of the diamond." All her mother's influence failed to extract from her a word more than that. Here we were, then, at a deadlock about Miss Rachel, and at a deadlock about the Moonstone. In the first case my lady was powerless to help us. In the second, as you shall presently judge, Mr. Seagrave was fast approaching the condition of a superintendent at his wits' end. Having ferreted about all over the boudoir without making any discoveries among the furniture, our experienced officer applied to me to know whether the servants in general were or were not acquainted with the place in which the diamond had been put for the night. "I knew where it was put, sir," I said, "to begin with. Samuel the footman knew also, for he was present in the hall when they were talking about where the diamond was to be kept that night. My daughter knew, as she has already told you. She or Samuel may have mentioned the thing to the other servants, or the other servants may have heard the talk for themselves through the side door of the hall, which might have been open to the back staircase. For all I can tell, everybody in the house may have known where the jewel was last night." My answer presenting rather a wide field for Mr. Superintendent's suspicions to range over, he tried to narrow it by asking about the servants' characters next. I thought directly of Rosanna Spearman, but it was neither my place nor my wish to direct suspicion against a poor girl whose honesty had been above all doubt as long as I had known her. The matron of the reformatory had reported her to my lady as a sincerely penitent and thoroughly trustworthy girl. It was the superintendent's business to discover reason for suspecting her first, and then, and not till then, it would be my duty to tell him how she came into my lady's service. "All our people have excellent characters," I said, "and all have deserved the trust their mistress has placed in them." After that there was but one thing left for Mr. Seagrave to do, namely to set to work and tackle the servants' characters himself. One after another they were examined. One after another they proved to have nothing to say, and said it, so far as the women were concerned, at great length, and with a very angry sense of the embargo laid on their bedrooms. The rest of them being sent back to their places downstairs, Penelope was then summoned and examined separately a second time. My daughter's little outbreak of temper in the boudoir, and her readiness to think herself suspected, appeared to have produced an unfavourable impression on Superintendent Seagrave. It seemed also to dwell a little on his mind that she had been the last person who saw the diamond at night. When the second questioning was over, my girl came back to me in a frenzy. There was no doubt of it any longer. The police officer had almost as good as told her she was the thief. I could scarcely believe him, taking Mr. Franklin's view, to be quite such an ass as that. But though he said nothing, the eye with which he looked at my daughter was not a very pleasant eye to see. I laughed it off with poor Penelope as something too ridiculous to be treated seriously, which it certainly was. Secretly, I am afraid, I was foolish enough to be angry too. It was a little trying, it was indeed. My girl sat down in a corner with her apron over her head, quite broken-hearted. Foolish of her, you will say. She might have waited till he openly accused her. Well, being a man of just and equal temper, I admit that. Still, Mr. Superintendent might have remembered— never mind what he might have remembered. The devil take him. The next and last step in the investigation brought matters, as they say, to a crisis. The officer had an interview, at which I was present, with my lady. After informing her that the diamond must have been taken by somebody in the house, he requested permission for himself and his men to search the servants' rooms and boxes on the spot. My good mistress, like the generous high-bred woman she was, refused to let us be treated like thieves. "I will never consent to make such a return as that," she said, "for all I owe to the faithful servants who are employed in my house." Mr. Superintendent made his bow, with a look in my direction which said plainly, "Why employ me if you are to tie my hands in this way?" As head of the servants I felt directly that we were bound, in justice to all parties, not to profit by our mistress's generosity. "We gratefully thank your ladyship," I said, "but we ask permission to do what is right in this matter by giving up our keys. When Gabriel Betteridge sets the example," says I, stopping Superintendent Seagrave at the door, "the rest of the servants will follow, I promise you. There are my keys to begin with." My lady took me by the hand and thanked me with the tears in her eyes. Lord, what would I not have given at that moment for the privilege of knocking Superintendent Seagrave down! As I had promised for them, the other servants followed my lead, sorely against the grain, of course, but all taking the view that I took. The women were a sight to see while the police officers were rummaging among their things. The cook looked as if she could grill Mr. Superintendent alive on a furnace, and the other women looked as if they could eat him when he was done. The search over, and no diamond or sign of a diamond being found, of course, anywhere, Superintendent Seagrave retired to my little room to consider with himself what he was to do next. He and his men had now been hours in the house, and had not advanced us 1 inch towards a discovery of how the Moonstone had been taken, or of whom we were to suspect as the thief. While the police officer was still pondering in solitude, I was sent for to see Mr. Franklin in the library. To my unutterable astonishment, just as my hand was on the door, it was suddenly opened from the inside, and out walked Rosanna Spearman. After the library had been swept and cleaned in the morning, neither first nor second housemaid had any business in that room at any later period of the day. I stopped Rosanna Spearman and charged her with a breach of domestic discipline on the spot. "What might you want in the library at this time of day?" I inquired. "Mr. Franklin Blake dropped one of his rings upstairs," says Rosanna, "and I have been into the library to give it to him." The girl's face was all in a flush as she made me that answer, and she walked away with a toss of her head and a look of self-importance which I was quite at a loss to account for. The proceedings in the house had doubtless upset all the women servants more or less, but none of them had gone clean out of their natural characters, as Rosanna, to all appearance, had now gone out of hers. I found Mr. Franklin writing at the library table. He asked for a conveyance to the railway station the moment I entered the room. The first sound of his voice informed me that we now had the resolute side of him uppermost once more. The man made of cotton had disappeared, and the man made of iron sat before me again. "Going to London, sir?" I asked. "Going to telegraph to London," says Mr. Franklin. "I have convinced my aunt that we must have a cleverer head than Superintendent Seagraves to help us, and I have got her permission to dispatch a telegram to my father. He knows the Chief Commissioner of Police, and the Commissioner can lay his hand on the right man to solve the mystery of the diamond. Talking of mysteries, by the by," says Mr. Franklin, dropping his voice, "I have another word to say to you before you go to the stables. Don't breathe a word of it to anybody as yet, but either Rosanna Spearman's head is not quite right, or I am afraid she knows more about the Moonstone than she ought to know." I can hardly tell whether I was more startled or distressed at hearing him say that. If I had been younger I might have confessed as much to Mr. Franklin, but when you are old you acquire one excellent habit. In cases where you don't see your way clearly, you hold your tongue. "She came in here with a ring I dropped in my bedroom," Mr. Franklin went on. "When I had thanked her, of course I expected her to go. Instead of that she stood opposite to me at the table, looking at me in the oddest manner, half frightened and half familiar. I couldn't make it out. 'This is a strange thing about the diamond, sir,' she said in a curiously sudden, headlong way. I said yes, it was, and wondered what was coming next. Upon my honour, Betteridge, I think she must be wrong in the head. She said, 'They will never find the diamond, sir, will they? No, nor the person who took it. I'll answer for that.' She actually nodded and smiled at me. Before I could ask her what she meant, we heard your step outside. I suppose she was afraid of your catching her here. At any rate, she changed colour and left the room. What on earth does it mean?" I could not bring myself to tell him the girl's story even then. It would have been almost as good as telling him that she was the thief. Besides, even if I had made a clean breast of it, and even supposing she was the thief, the reason why she should let out her secret to Mr. Franklin, of all the people in the world, would have been still as far to seek as ever. I can't bear the idea of getting the poor girl into a scrape merely because she has a flighty way with her and talks very strangely," Mr. Franklin went on. "And yet if she had said to the superintendent what she said to me, fool as he is, I'm afraid—" He stopped there and left the rest unspoken. "The best way, sir," I said, "will be for me to say 2 words privately to my mistress about it at the first opportunity. My lady has a very friendly interest in Rosanna, and the girl may only have been forward and foolish after all. When there's a mess of any kind in a house, sir, the women servants like to look at the gloomy side. It gives the poor wretches a kind of importance in their own eyes. If there's anybody ill, trust the women for prophesying that the person will die. If it's a jewel lost, trust them for prophesying that it will never be found again." This view, which I am bound to say I thought a probable view myself on reflection, seemed to relieve Mr. Franklin mightily. He folded up his telegram and dismissed the subject. On my way to the stables to order the pony chaise, I looked in at the servants' hall, where they were at dinner. Rosanna Spearman was not among them. On inquiry I found that she had been suddenly taken ill, and had gone upstairs to her own room to lie down. "Curious, she looked well enough when I saw her last," I remarked. Penelope followed me out. "Don't talk in that way before the rest of them, father," she said. "You only make them harder on Rosanna than ever. The poor thing is breaking her heart about Mr. Franklin Blake." Here was another view of the girl's conduct. If it was possible for Penelope to be right, the explanation of Rosanna's strange language and behaviour might have been all in this, that she didn't care what she said so long as she could surprise Mr. Franklin into speaking to her. Granting that to be the right reading of the riddle, it accounted perhaps for her flighty, self-conceited manner when she passed me in the hall. Though he had only said 3 words, still she had carried her point, and Mr. Franklin had spoken to her. I saw the pony harnessed myself. In the infernal network of mysteries and uncertainties that now surrounded us, I declare it was a relief to observe how well the buckles and straps understood each other. When you had seen the pony backed into the shafts of the chaise, you had seen something there was no doubt about, and that, let me tell you, was becoming a treat of the rarest kind in our household. Going round with the chaise to the front door, I found not only Mr. Franklin, but Mr. Godfrey and Superintendent Seagrave also waiting for me on the steps. Mr. Superintendent's reflections, after failing to find the diamond in the servants' rooms or boxes, had led him, it appeared, to an entirely new conclusion. Still sticking to his first text, namely that somebody in the house had stolen the jewel, our experienced officer was now of opinion that the thief — he was wise enough not to name poor Penelope, whatever he might privately think of her — had been acting in concert with the Indians, and he accordingly proposed shifting his inquiries to the jugglers in the prison at Frizinghall. Hearing of this new move, Mr. Franklin had volunteered to take the superintendent back to the town, from which he could telegraph to London as easily as from our station. Mr. Godfrey, still devoutly believing in Mr. Seagrave, and greatly interested in witnessing the examination of the Indians, had begged leave to accompany the officer to Frizinghall. One of the 2 inferior policemen was to be left at the house in case anything happened. The other was to go back with the superintendent to the town. So the 4 places in the pony chaise were just filled. Before he took the reins to drive off, Mr. Franklin walked me away a few steps, out of hearing of the others. "I will wait to telegraph to London," he said, "till I see what comes of our examination of the Indians. My own conviction is that this muddle-headed local police officer is as much in the dark as ever, and is simply trying to gain time. The idea of any of the servants being in league with the Indians is a preposterous absurdity, in my opinion. Keep about the house, Betteridge, till I come back, and try what you can make of Rosanna Spearman. I don't ask you to do anything degrading to your own self-respect, or anything cruel towards the girl. I only ask you to exercise your observation more carefully than usual. We will make as light of it as we can before my aunt, but this is a more important matter than you may suppose." "It is a matter of £20,000, sir," I said, thinking of the value of the diamond. "It's a matter of quieting Rachel's mind," answered Mr. Franklin gravely. "I am very uneasy about her." He left me suddenly, as if he desired to cut short any further talk between us. I thought I understood why. Further talk might have let me into the secret of what Miss Rachel had said to him on the terrace. So they drove away to Frizinghall. I was ready enough, in the girl's own interest, to have a little talk with Rosanna in private. But the needful opportunity failed to present itself. She only came downstairs again at tea-time. When she did appear she was flighty and excited, had what they call an hysterical attack, took a dose of sal volatile by my lady's order, and was sent back to her bed. The day wore on to its end drearily and miserably enough, I can tell you. Miss Rachel still kept her room, declaring that she was too ill to come down to dinner that day. My lady was in such low spirits about her daughter that I could not bring myself to make her additionally anxious by reporting what Rosanna Spearman had said to Mr. Franklin. Penelope persisted in believing that she was to be forthwith tried, sentenced, and transported for theft. The other women took to their Bibles and hymn-books, and looked as sour as verjuice over their reading, a result which I have observed in my sphere of life to follow generally on the performance of acts of piety at unaccustomed periods of the day. As for me, I hadn't even heart enough to open my Robinson Crusoe. I went out into the yard, and, being hard up for a little cheerful society, set my chair by the kennels, and talked to the dogs. Half an hour before dinner-time the two gentlemen came back from Frizinghall, having arranged with Superintendent Seagrave that he was to return to us the next day. They had called on Mr. Murthwaite, the Indian traveller, at his present residence near the town. At Mr. Franklin's request he had kindly given them the benefit of his knowledge of the language in dealing with those 2 out of the 3 Indians who knew nothing of English. The examination, conducted carefully and at great length, had ended in nothing, not the shadow of a reason being discovered for suspecting the jugglers of having tampered with any of our servants. On reaching that conclusion, Mr. Franklin had sent his telegraphic message to London, and there the matter now rested till tomorrow came. So much for the history of the day that followed the birthday. Not a glimmer of light had broken in on us so far. A day or two after, however, the darkness lifted a little. How, and with what result, you shall presently see. End of chapter 11.
The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Read by Gesine. Chapter 12. The Thursday night passed, and nothing happened. With the Friday morning came 2 pieces of news. Item the first. The baker's man declared he had met Rosanna Spearman on the previous afternoon with a thick veil on, walking towards Frizinghall by the footpath way over the moor. It seemed strange that anybody should be mistaken about Rosanna, whose shoulder marked her out pretty plainly, poor thing. But mistaken the man must have been, for Rosanna, as you know, had been all the Thursday afternoon ill upstairs in her room. Item the second came through the postman. Worthy Mr. Candy had said one more of his many unlucky things when he drove off in the rain on the birthday night, and told me that the doctor's skin was waterproof. In spite of his skin, the wet had got through him. He had caught a chill that night, and was now down with a fever. The last accounts, brought by the postman, represented him to be light-headed, talking nonsense as glibly, poor man, in his delirium as he often talked in his sober senses. We were all sorry for the little doctor, but Mr. Franklin appeared to regret his illness, chiefly on Miss Rachel's account. From what he said to my lady, while I was in the room at breakfast time. He appeared to think that Miss Rachel, if the suspense about the Moonstone was not soon set at rest, might stand in urgent need of the best medical advice at our disposal. Breakfast had not been over long when a telegram from Mr. Blake the elder arrived, in answer to his son. It informed us that he had laid hands, by help of his friend, the Commissioner, on the right man to help us. The name of him was Sergeant Cuff, and the arrival of him from London might be expected by the morning train. At reading the name of the new police officer, Mr. Franklin gave a start. It seems that he had heard some curious anecdotes about Sergeant Cuff from his father's lawyer during his stay in London. "I begin to hope we are seeing the end of our anxieties already," he said. "If half the stories I have heard are true, when it comes to unravelling a mystery there isn't the equal in England of Sergeant Cuff." We all got excited and impatient as the time drew near for the appearance of this renowned and capable character. Superintendent Seagrave, returning to us at his appointed time, and hearing that the sergeant was expected, instantly shut himself up in a room, with pen, ink, and paper, to make notes of the report which would be certainly expected from him. I should have liked to have gone to the station myself, to fetch the sergeant. But my lady's carriage and horses were not to be thought of, even for the celebrated Cuff, and the pony-chaise was required later for Mr. Godfrey. He deeply regretted being obliged to leave his aunt at such an anxious time, and he kindly put off the hour of his departure till as late as the last train, for the purpose of hearing what the clever London police officer thought of the case. But on Friday night he must be in town, having a ladies' charity in difficulties waiting to consult him on Saturday morning. When the time came for the sergeant's arrival, I went down to the gate to look out for him. A fly from the railway drove up as I reached the lodge, and out got a grizzled, elderly man, so miserably lean that he looked as if he had not got an ounce of flesh on his bones in any part of him. He was dressed all in decent black, with a white cravat round his neck. His face was as sharp as a hatchet, and the skin of it was as yellow and dry and withered as an autumn leaf. His eyes, of a steely light grey, had a very disconcerting trick, when they encountered your eyes, of looking as if they expected something more from you than you were aware of yourself. His walk was soft, his voice was melancholy, his long lanky fingers were hooked like claws. He might have been a parson or an undertaker, or anything else you like, except what he really was. A more complete opposite to Superintendent Seagrave than Sergeant Cuff, and a less comforting officer to look at, for a family in distress, I defy you to discover, search where you may. "Is this Lady Verandas?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I am Sergeant Cuff. This way, sir, if you please." On our road to the house, I mentioned my name and position in the family to satisfy him that he might speak to me about the business on which my lady was to employ him. Not a word did he say about the business, however, for all that. He admired the grounds, and remarked that he felt the sea air very brisk and refreshing. I privately wondered, on my side, how the celebrated Cuff had got his reputation. We reached the house, in the temper of two strange dogs, coupled up together for the first time in their lives by the same chain. Asking for my lady, and hearing that she was in one of the conservatories, we went round to the gardens at the back, and sent a servant to seek her. While we were waiting, Sergeant Cuff looked through the evergreen arch on our left, spied out our rosery, and walked straight in, with the first appearance of anything like interest that he had shown yet. To the gardener's astonishment, and to my disgust, this celebrated policeman proved to be quite a mine of learning on the trumpery subject of rose gardens. "Ah, you've got the right exposure here to the south and sou'west," says the sergeant, with a wag of his grizzled head, and a streak of pleasure in his melancholy voice. "This is the shape for a rosary, nothing like a circle set in a square. Yes, with walks between all the beds. But they oughtn't to be gravel walks like these, Grass, Mr. Gardener, grass walks between your roses. Gravel's too hard for them. That's a sweet, pretty bed of white roses and blush roses. They always mix well together, don't they? Here's the white musk rose, Mr. Betteridge, our old English rose, holding up its head along with the best and the newest of them. Pretty dear, says the sergeant, fondling the musk rose with his lanky fingers and speaking to it as if he was speaking to a child. This was a nice sort of man to discover Miss Rachel's diamond, and to find out the thief who stole it. You seem to be fond of roses, Sergeant, I remarked. I haven't much time to be fond of anything, says Sergeant Cuff, but when I have a moment's fondness to bestow, most times, Mr. Betteridge, the roses get it. I began my life among them in my father's nursery garden, and I shall end my life among them if I can. Yes, one of these days, please God, I shall retire from catching thieves, and try my hand at growing roses. There will be grass walks, Mr. Gardener, between my beds, says the sergeant, on whose mind the gravel paths of our rosery seemed to dwell unpleasantly. It seems an odd taste, sir, I ventured to say, for a man in your line of life. If you will look about you, which most people won't do, says Sergeant Cuff, you will see that the nature of a man's tastes is, most times, as opposite as possible to the nature of a man's business. Show me any two things more opposite, one from the other, than a rose and a thief, and I'll correct my tastes accordingly, if it isn't too late at my time of life. You find the damask rose a goodish stock for most of the tender sorts, don't you, Mr. Gardener? Ah, I thought so. Here's a lady coming. Is it Lady Verinder? He had seen her before either I or the gardener had seen her, though he knew which way to look, and he didn't. I began to think him rather a quicker man than he appeared to be at first sight. The sergeant's appearance, or the sergeant's errand, one or both, seemed to cause my lady some little embarrassment. She was, for the first time in all my experience of her, at a loss what to say at an interview with a stranger. Sergeant Cuff put her at her ease directly. He asked if any other person had been employed about the robbery before we sent for him, and hearing that another person had been called in, and was now in the house, begged leave to speak with him before anything else was done. My lady led the way back. Before he followed her, the sergeant relieved his mind on the subject of the gravel walks by a parting word to the gardener. "Get her ladyship to try grass," he said, with a sour look at the paths. "No gravel, no gravel." Why Superintendent Seagrave should have appeared to be several sizes smaller than life on being presented to Sergeant Cuff, I can't undertake to explain. I can only state the fact. They retired together and remained a weary long time shut up from all mortal intrusion. When they came out, Mr. Superintendent was excited, and Mr. Sergeant was yawning. "The sergeant wishes to see Miss Verinder's sitting-room," says Mr. Seagrave, addressing me with great pomp and eagerness. "The sergeant may have some questions to ask. Attend the sergeant, if you please." While I was being ordered about in this way, I looked at the great Cuff. The great Cuff, on his side, looked at Superintendent Seagrave in that quietly expecting way which I have already noticed. I can't affirm that he was on the watch for his brother officer's speedy appearance in the character of an ass. I can only say that I strongly suspected it. I led the way upstairs. The sergeant went softly all over the Indian cabinet and all round the boudoir, asking questions, occasionally only of Mr. Superintendent and continually of me, the drift of which I believe to have been equally unintelligible to both of us. In due time, his course brought him to the door, and put him face to face with a decorative painting that you know of. He laid one lean inquiring finger on the small smear, just under the lock, which Superintendent Seagrave had already noticed, when he reproved the women servants for all crowding together into the room. "That's a pity," says Sergeant Cuff. "How did it happen?" He put the question to me. I answered that the women servants had crowded into the room on the previous morning, and that some of their petticoats had done the mischief. "Superintendent Seagrave ordered them out, sir, I added, before they did any more harm. "Right," says Mr. Superintendent in his military way. "I ordered them out. The petticoats did it, Sergeant. The petticoats did it." "Did you notice which petticoat did it?" asked Sergeant Cuff, still addressing himself not to his brother officer, but to me. "No, sir." He turned to Superintendent Seagrave upon that, and said, "You noticed, I suppose?" Mr. Superintendent looked a little taken aback, but he made the best of it. "I can't charge my memory, Sergeant," he said. "A mere trifle, a mere trifle." Sergeant Cuff looked at Mr. Seagrave as he had looked at the gravel walks and the rosary, and gave us, in his melancholy way, the first taste of his quality which we had had yet. "I made a private inquiry last week, Mr. Superintendent," he said. "At one end of the inquiry there was a murder, and at the other end there was a spot of ink on a tablecloth that nobody could account for. In all my experience along the dirtiest ways of this dirty little world, I have never met with such a thing as a trifle yet. Before we go a step further in this business we must see the petticoat that made the smear, and we must know for certain when that paint was wet." Mr. Superintendent, taking his set down rather sulkily, asked if he should summon the women. Sergeant Cuff, after considering a minute, sighed and shook his head. "No," he said. "We'll take the matter of the paint first. It's a question of yes or no with the paint, which is short. It's a question of petticoats with the women, which is long. What o'clock was it when the servants were in this room yesterday morning? 11 o'clock, eh? Is there anybody in the house who knows whether that paint was wet or dry at 11 yesterday morning?" "Her ladyship's nephew, Mr. Franklin Blake, knows," I said. "Is the gentleman in the house?" Mr. Franklin was as close at hand as could be, waiting for his first chance of being introduced to the great Cuff. In half a minute he was in the room, and was giving his evidence as follows. "The door, Sergeant," he said, "has been painted by Miss Verinder, under my inspection, with my help, and in a vehicle of my own composition. The vehicle dries whatever colours may be used with it, in 12 hours. "Do you remember when the smeared bit was done, sir?" asked the sergeant. "Perfectly," answered Mr. Franklin. "That was the last morsel of the door to be finished. We wanted to get it done on Wednesday last, and I myself completed it by 3 in the afternoon, or soon after." "To-day is Friday," said Sergeant Cuff, addressing himself to Superintendent Seagrave. "Let us reckon back, sir. At 3 on the Wednesday afternoon that bit of the painting was completed. The vehicle dried it in 12 hours, that is to say, dried it by 3 o'clock on Thursday morning. At 11 on Thursday morning you held your inquiry here. Take 3 hours from 11 and 8 remains. That paint had been 8 hours dry, Mr. Superintendent, when you supposed that the women servants' petticoats smeared it." First knock-down blow for Mr. Seagrave. If he had not suspected poor Penelope, I should have pitied him. Having settled the question of the paint, Sergeant Cuff, from that moment, gave his brother officer up as a bad job, and addressed himself to Mr. Franklin as the more promising assistant of the two. "It's quite on the cards, sir," he said, "that you have put the clue into our hands." As the words passed his lips, the bedroom door opened, and Miss Rachel came out among us suddenly. She addressed herself to the sergeant without appearing to notice or to heed that he was a perfect stranger to her. "Did you say," she asked, pointing to Mr. Franklin, "that he had put the clue into your hands?" "This is Miss Verinder," I whispered, behind the sergeant. "That gentleman, miss," said the sergeant, with his steely grey eyes carefully studying my young lady's face, "has possibly put the clue into our hands." She turned for one moment and tried to look at Mr. Franklin. I say tried, for she suddenly looked away again before their eyes met. There seemed to be some strange disturbance in her mind. She coloured up, and then she turned pale again. With the paleness there came a new look into her face, a look which it startled me to see. "Having answered your question, miss," says the sergeant, "I beg leave to make an inquiry in my turn. There is a smear on the painting of your door here. Do you happen to know when it was done, or who did it?" Instead of making any reply, Miss Rachel went on with her questions as if he had not spoken, or as if she had not heard him. "Are you another police officer?" she asked. "I am Sergeant Cuff, miss, of the detective police." "Do you think a young lady's advice worth having?" "I shall be glad to hear it, miss." "Do your duty by yourself, and don't allow Mr. Franklin Blade to help you." She said those words so spitefully, so savagely, with such an extraordinary outbreak of ill will towards Mr. Franklin, in her voice and in her look, that, although I had known her myself from a baby, though I loved and honoured her next to my lady herself, I was ashamed of Miss Rachel for the first time in my life. Sergeant Cuff's immovable eyes never stirred from off her face. "Thank you, miss," he said. "Do you happen to know anything about the smear? Might you have done it by accident yourself?" "I know nothing about the smear." With that answer she turned away, and shut herself up again in her bedroom. This time I heard her, as Penelope had heard her before, burst out crying as soon as she was alone again. I couldn't bring myself to look at the sergeant. I looked at Mr. Franklin, who stood nearest to me. He seemed to be even more sorely distressed at what had passed than I was. "I told you I was uneasy about her," he said, "and now you see why." "Miss Verinder appears to be a little out of temper about the loss of her diamond," remarked the sergeant. "It's a valuable jewel. Natural enough, natural enough." Here was the excuse that I had made for her, when she forgot herself before Superintendent Seagrave on the previous day, being made for her over again by a man who couldn't have had my interest in making it, for he was a perfect stranger. A kind of cold shudder ran through me, which I couldn't account for at the time. I know now that I must have got my first suspicion, at that moment, of a new light, and a horrid light, having suddenly fallen on the case in the mind of Sergeant Cuff, purely and entirely in consequence of what he had seen in Miss Rachel, and heard from Miss Rachel, at that first interview between them. "A young lady's tongue is a privileged member, sir," says the sergeant to Mr. Franklin. "Let us forget what has passed, and go straight on with this business. Thanks to you, we know when the paint was dry. The next thing to discover is when the paint was last seen without that smear. You have got a head on your shoulders, and you understand what I mean." Mr. Franklin composed himself, and came back with an effort from Miss Rachel to the matter in hand. "I think I do understand," he said. "The more we narrow the question of time, the more we also narrow the field of inquiry." "That's it, sir," said the sergeant. "Did you notice your work here, on the Wednesday afternoon after you had done it?" Mr. Franklin shook his head and answered, "I can't say I did." "Did you?" inquired Sergeant Cuff, turning to me. "I can't say I did either, sir." "Who was the last person in the room, the last thing on Wednesday night?" "Miss Rachel, I suppose, sir." Mr. Franklin struck in there. "Or possibly your daughter, Betteridge." He turned to Sergeant Cuff and explained that my daughter was Miss Verinder's maid. "Mr. Betteridge, ask your daughter to step up. Stop," says the sergeant, taking me away to the window, out of earshot. "Your superintendent here," he went on, in a whisper, "has made a pretty full report to me of the manner in which he has managed the case. Among other things, he has, by his own confession, set the servants back up. It's very important to smooth them down again. Tell your daughter, and tell the rest of them, these two things with my compliments. First, that I have no evidence before me yet that the diamond has been stolen. I only know that the diamond has been lost. Second, that my business here with the servants is simply to ask them to lay their heads together and help me to find it. My experience of the women servants, when Superintendent Seagrave laid his embargo on their rooms, came in handy here. May I make so bold, Sergeant, as to tell the women a third thing? I asked. Are they free, with your compliments, to fidget up and downstairs, and whisk in and out of their bedrooms, if the fit takes them? Perfectly free. said the sergeant. "That will smooth them down, sir," I remarked, "from the cook to the scullion." "Go and do it at once, Mr. Betteredge." I did it in less than 5 minutes. There was only one difficulty when it came to the bit about the bedrooms. It took a pretty stiff exertion of my authority as chief to prevent the whole of the female household from following me and Penelope upstairs in the character of volunteer witnesses in a burning fever of anxiety to help Sergeant Cuff. The sergeant seemed to approve of Penelope. He became a trifle less dreary, and he looked much as he had looked when he noticed the white musk rose in the flower garden. Here is my daughter's evidence as drawn off from her by the sergeant. She gave it, I think, very prettily. But there, she is my child all over. Nothing of her mother and her. Lord bless you, nothing of her mother and her. Penelope examined. Took a lively interest in the painting on the door, having helped to mix the colours. Noticed the bit of work under the lock, because it was the last bit done. Had seen it, some hours afterwards, without the smear. Had left it, as late as 12 at night, without a smear. Had, at that hour, wished her young lady good night in the bedroom. Had heard the clock strike in the boudoir. Had her hand on the time, on the handle of the painted door. Knew the paint was wet, having helped to mix the colours, as aforesaid. Took particular pains not to touch it. Could swear that she had held up the skirts of her dress, and that there was no smear on the paint then. Could not swear that her dress mightn't have touched it accidentally in going out. Remembered the dress she had on because it was new, a present from Miss Rachel. Her father remembered and could speak to it, too. Could and would and did fetch it. Dress recognized by her father as the dress she wore that night. Skirts examined. A long job from the size of them. Not the ghost of a paint stain discovered anywhere. End of Penelope's evidence, and very pretty and convincing, too. Signed Gabriel Betteredge. The sergeant's next proceeding was to question me about any large dogs in the house, who might have got into the room and done the mischief with a whisk of their tails. Hearing that this was impossible, he next sent for a magnifying glass, and tried how the smear looked, seen that way. No skin mark, as of a human hand, printed off on the paint. All the signs visible, signs which told that the paint had been smeared by some loose article of somebody's dress touching it in going by. That somebody, putting together Penelope's evidence and Mr. Franklin's evidence, must have been in the room and done the mischief between midnight and 3 o'clock on the Thursday morning. Having brought his investigation to this point, Sergeant Cuff discovered that such a person as Superintendent Seagrave was still left in the room, upon which he summoned up the proceedings for his brother officer's benefit, as follows. "This trifle of yours, Mr. Superintendent," says the sergeant, pointing to the place on the door, "has grown a little in importance since you noticed it last. At the present stage of the inquiry there are, as I take it, 3 discoveries to make, starting from that smear. Find out, first, whether there is any article of dress in this house with the smear of the paint on it. Find out, second, who that dress belongs to. Find out, third, how the person can account for having been in this room and smear the paint between midnight and 3 in the morning. If the person can't satisfy you, you haven't far to look for the hand that has got the diamond. I'll work this by myself, if you please, and detain you no longer from your regular business in the town. You have got one of your men here, I see. Leave him here at my disposal in case I want him, and allow me to wish you good morning." Superintendent Seagrave's respect for the sergeant was great, but his respect for himself was greater still. Hit hard by the celebrated Cuff, he hit back smartly, to the best of his ability, on leaving the room. "I have abstained from expressing any opinion so far," says Mr. Superintendent, with his military voice still in good working order. "I have now only one remark to offer on leaving this case in your hands. There is such a thing, Sergeant, as making a mountain out of a molehill. Good morning." "There is also such a thing as making nothing out of a molehill, in consequence of your head being too high to see it." Having returned his brother officer's compliments in those terms, Sergeant Cuff wheeled about, and walked away to the window by himself. Mr. Franklin and I waited to see what was coming next. The sergeant stood at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out and whistling the tune of "The Last Rose of Summer" softly to himself. Later in the proceedings I discovered that he only forgot his manners so far as to whistle, when his mind was hard at work, seeing its way inch by inch to its own private ends, on which occasions "The Last Rose of Summer" evidently helped and encouraged him. I suppose it fitted in somehow with his character. It reminded him, you see, of his favourite roses, and as he whistled it, it was the most melancholy tune going. Turning from the window, after a minute or two, the sergeant walked into the middle of the room and stopped there, deep in thought, with his eyes on Miss Rachel's bedroom door. After a little he roused himself, nodded his head, as much as to say, "That will do," and addressing me, asked for 10 minutes' conversation with my mistress, at her ladyship's earliest convenience. Leaving the room with this message, I heard Mr. Franklin ask the sergeant a question, and stopped to hear the answer, also at the threshold of the door. "Can you guess yet," inquired Mr. Franklin, "who has stolen the diamond?" "Nobody has stolen the diamond," answered Sergeant Cuff. We both stared at that extraordinary view of the case, and both earnestly begged him to tell us what he meant. "Wait a little," said the sergeant. "The pieces of the puzzle are not all put together yet." End of chapter 12. Recorded by Gesine in August 2007. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Read by Gesine. Chapter 13. I found my lady in her own sitting-room. She started and looked annoyed when I mentioned that Sergeant Cuff wished to speak to her. "Must I see him?" she asked. "Can't you represent me, Gabriel?" I felt at a loss to understand this, and showed it plainly, I suppose, in my face. My lady was so good as to explain herself. "I am afraid my nerves are a little shaken," she said. "There is something in that police officer from London which I recoil from. I don't know why. I have a presentiment that he is bringing trouble and misery with him into the house. Very foolish and very unlike me, but so it is." I hardly knew what to say to this. The more I saw of Sergeant Cuff, the better I liked him. My lady rallied a little after having opened her heart to me, being naturally a woman of high courage, as I have already told you. "If I must see him, I must," she said. "But I can't prevail on myself to see him alone. Bring him in, Gabriel, and stay here as long as he stays." This was the first attack of the megrims that I remembered in my mistress since the time when she was a young girl. I went back to the boudoir. Mr. Franklin strolled out into the garden, and joined Mr. Godfrey, whose time for departure was now drawing near. Sergeant Cuff and I went straight to my mistress's room. I declare that my lady turned a shade paler at the sight of him. She commanded herself, however, in other respects, and asked the sergeant if he had any objection to my being present. She was so good as to add that I was her trusted adviser, as well as her old servant, and that in anything which related to the household I was the person whom it might be most profitable to consult. The sergeant politely answered that he would take my presence as a favour, having something to say about the servants in general, and having found my experience in that quarter already of some use to him. My lady pointed to 2 chairs, and we set in for our conference immediately. "I have already formed an opinion on this case," says Sergeant Cuff, "which I beg your ladyship's permission to keep to myself for the present. My business now is to mention what I have discovered upstairs, in Miss Verander's sitting-room, and what I have decided, with your ladyship's leave, on doing next." He then went into the matter of the smear on the paint, and stated the conclusions he drew from it, just as he had stated them, only with greater respect of language, to Superintendent Seagrave. One thing, he said in conclusion, is certain. The diamond is missing out of the drawer in the cabinet. Another thing is next to certain. The marks from the smear on the door must be on some article of dress belonging to somebody in this house. We must discover that article of dress before we go a step further. And that discovery, remarked my mistress, implies, I presume, the discovery of the thief? I beg your ladyship's pardon. I don't say the diamond is stolen. I only say at present that the diamond is missing. The discovery of the stained dress may lead the way to finding it. Her ladyship looked at me. "Do you understand this?" she said. "Sergeant Cuff understands it, my lady," I answered. "How do you propose to discover the stained dress?" inquired my mistress, addressing herself once more to the sergeant. "My good servants, who have been with me for years, have, I am ashamed to say, had their boxes and rooms searched already by the other officer. I can't and won't permit them to be insulted in that way a second time." There was a mistress to serve. There was a woman in 10,000, if you like. "That is the very point I was about to put to your ladyship," said the sergeant. "The other officer has done a world of harm to this inquiry, by letting the servants see that he suspected them. If I give them cause to think themselves suspected a second time, there's no knowing what obstacles they may not throw in my way, the women especially. At the same time, their boxes must be searched again, for this plain reason, that the first investigation only looked for the diamond, and that the second investigation must look for the stained dress. I quite agree with you, my lady, that the servants' feelings ought to be consulted. But I am equally clear that the servants' wardrobes ought to be searched." This looked very like a deadlock. My lady said so, in choicer language than mine. "I have got a plan to meet the difficulty," said Sergeant Cuff, "if your ladyship will consent to it. I propose explaining the case to the servants." "The women will think themselves suspected directly," I said, interrupting him. "The women won't, Mr. Betteridge," answered the sergeant. "If I can tell them I am going to examine the wardrobes of everybody, from her ladyship downwards, who slept in the house on Wednesday night. It's a mere formality," he added with a side look at my mistress, "but the servants will accept it as even dealing between them and their betters, and instead of hindering the investigation, they will make it a point of honour of assisting it." I saw the truth of that. My lady, after her first surprise was over, saw the truth of it also. "You are certain the investigation is necessary?" she said. "It's the shortest way I can see, my lady, to the end we have in view." My mistress rose to ring the bell for her maid. "You shall speak to the servants," she said, "with the keys of my wardrobe in your hand." Sergeant Cuff stopped her by a very unexpected question. "Hadn't we better make sure first," he asked, "that the other ladies and gentlemen in the house will consent too?" "The only other lady in the house is Miss Verinder," answered my mistress with a look of surprise. "The only gentlemen are my nephews, Mr. Blake and Mr. Ablewhite. There is not the least fear of a refusal from any of the three." I reminded my lady here that Mr. Godfrey was going away. As I said the words, Mr. Godfrey himself knocked at the door to say good-bye, and was followed in by Mr. Franklin, who was going with him to the station. My lady explained the difficulty. Mr. Godfrey settled it directly. He called to Samuel through the window to take his portmanteau upstairs again, and he then put the key himself into Sergeant Cuff's hand. "My luggage can follow me to London," he said, "when the inquiry is over." The sergeant received the key with a becoming apology. "I am sorry to put you to any inconvenience, sir, for a mere formality, but the example of their betters will do wonders in reconciling the servants to this inquiry." Mr. Godfrey, after taking leave of my lady in a most sympathizing manner, left a farewell message for Miss Rachel, the terms of which made it clear to my mind that he had not taken no for an answer, and that he meant to put the marriage question to her once more at the next opportunity. Mr. Franklin, on following his cousin out, informed the sergeant that all his clothes were open to examination, and that nothing he possessed was kept under lock and key. Sergeant Cuff made his best acknowledgments. His views, you will observe, had been met with the utmost readiness by my lady, by Mr. Godfrey, and by Mr. Franklin. There was only Miss Rachel now wanting to follow their lead, before we called the servants together and began the search for the stained dress. My lady's unaccountable objection to the sergeant seemed to make our conference more distasteful to her than ever, as soon as we were left alone again. "If I send you down Miss Verander's keys," she said to him, "I presume I shall have done all you want of me for the present?" "I beg your ladyship's pardon," said Sergeant Cuff. "Before we begin, I would like, if convenient, to have the washing book. The stained article of dress may be an article of linen. If the search leads to nothing, I want to be able to account next for all the linen in the house, and for all the linen sent to the wash. If there is an article missing, there will be at least a presumption that it has got the paint stain on it, and that it has been purposely made away with, yesterday or today, by the person owning it. Superintendent Seagrave," added the sergeant, turning to me, "pointed the attention of the women servants to the smear, when they all crowded into the room on Thursday morning. That may turn out, Mr. Betteridge, to have been one more of Superintendent Seagrave's many mistakes." My lady desired me to ring the bell, and order the washing book. She remained with us until it was produced, in case Sergeant Cuff had any further request to make of her after looking at it. The washing book was brought in by Rosanna Spearman. The girl had come down to breakfast that morning miserably pale and haggard, but sufficiently recovered from her illness of the previous day to do her usual work. Sergeant Cuff looked attentively at our second housemaid, at her face when she came in, at her crooked shoulder when she went out. "Have you anything more to say to me?" asked my lady, still as eager as ever to be out of the sergeant's society. The great Cuff opened the washing book, understood it perfectly in half a minute, and shut it up again. "I venture to trouble your ladyship with one last question," he said. "Has the young woman who brought us this book been in your employment as long as the other servants?" "Why do you ask?" said my lady. "The last time I saw her," answered the sergeant, "she was in prison for theft." After that there was no help for it but to tell him the truth. My mistress dwelt strongly on Rosanna's good conduct in her service, and on the high opinion entertained of her by the matron at the reformatory. "You don't suspect her, I hope," my lady added in conclusion, very earnestly. "I have already told your ladyship that I don't suspect any person in the house of thieving, up to the present time." After that answer, my lady rose to go upstairs and ask for Miss Rachel's keys. The sergeant was beforehand with me in opening the door for her. He made a very low bow. My lady shuddered as she passed him. We waited and waited, and no keys appeared. Sergeant Cuff made no remark to me. He turned his melancholy face to the window, He put his lanky hands into his pockets, and he whistled "The Last Rose of Summer" softly to himself. At last Samuel came in, not with the keys, but with a morsel of paper for me. I got at my spectacles, with some fumbling and difficulty, feeling the sergeant's dismal eyes fixed on me all the time. There were 2 or 3 lines on the paper, written in pencil by my lady. They informed me that Miss Rachel flatly refused to have her wardrobe examined. Asked for her reasons, she had burst out crying. Asked again, she had said, "I won't because I won't. I must yield to force if you use it, but I will yield to nothing else." I understood my lady's disinclination to face Sergeant Cuff with such an answer from her daughter as that. If I had not been too old for the amiable weaknesses of youth, I believe I should have blushed at the notion of facing him myself. "Any news of Miss Verander's keys?" asked the sergeant. "My young lady refuses to have her wardrobe examined." "Ah," said the sergeant. His voice was not quite in such a perfect state of discipline as his face. When he said "ah," he said it in the tone of a man who had heard something which he expected to hear. He half angered and half frightened me. Why, I couldn't tell, but he did it. "Must the search be given up?" I asked. "Yes," said the sergeant, "the search must be given up, because your young lady refuses to submit to it like the rest. We must examine all the wardrobes in the house, or none. Send Mr. Abel White's portmanteau to London by the next train, and return the washing book, with my compliments and thanks, to the young woman who brought it in." He laid the washing book on the table, and turning out his penknife, began to trim his nails. "You don't seem to be much disappointed," I said. "No," said Sergeant Cuff, "I am not much disappointed." I tried to make him explain himself. "Why should Miss Rachel put an obstacle in your way?" I inquired. "Isn't it her best interest to help you?" "Wait a little, Mr. Betteredge. Wait a little." Cleverer heads than mine might have seen his drift. Or a person less fond of Miss Rachel than I was might have seen his drift. My lady's horror of him might, as I have since thought, have meant that she saw his drift, as the scripture says, "in a glass darkly." I didn't see it yet, that's all I know. "What's to be done next?" I asked. Sergeant Cuff finished the nail on which he was then at work, looked at it for a moment with a melancholy interest, and put up his penknife. "Come out into the garden," he said, "and let's have a look at the roses." End of chapter 13. Recorded by Gesine in May 2007.
The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 14. The nearest way to the garden, on going out of my lady's sitting room, was by the shrubbery path, which you already know of. For the sake of your better understanding of what is now to come, I may add to this, that the shrubbery path was Mr. Franklin's favourite walk. When he was out in the grounds, and when we failed to find him anywhere else, we generally found him here. I am afraid I must own that I am rather an obstinate old man. The more firmly Sergeant Cuff kept his thoughts shut up from me, the more firmly I persisted in trying to look in at them. As we turned into the shrubbery path, I attempted to circumvent him in another way. "As things are now," I said, "if I was in your place, I should be at my wits' end." "If you were in my place," answered the sergeant, "you would have formed an opinion, and as things are now, any doubt you might previously have felt about your own conclusions would be completely set at rest. Never mind for the present what those conclusions are, Mr. Betteredge. I haven't brought you out here to draw me like a badger. I have brought you out here to ask for some information. You might have given it to me, no doubt, in the house, instead of out of it. But doors and listeners have a knack of getting together, and, in my line of life, we cultivate a healthy taste for the open air." Who was to circumvent this man? I gave in, and waited as patiently as I could to hear what was coming next. "We won't enter into your young lady's motives," the sergeant went on. "We will only say it's a pity she declines to assist me, because, by doing so, she makes this investigation more difficult than it might otherwise have been. We must now try to solve the mystery of the smear on the door, which, you may take my word for it, means the mystery of the diamond also in some other way. I have decided to see the servants, and to search their thoughts and actions, Mr. Betteredge, instead of searching their wardrobes. Before I begin, however, I want to ask you a question or two. You are an observant man. Did you notice anything strange in any of the servants, making due allowance, of course, for fright and fluster, after the loss of the diamond was found out? Any particular quarrel among them? Any one of them not in his usual spirits? Unexpectedly out of temper, for instance, or unexpectedly taken ill?" I had just time to think of Rosanna Spearman's sudden illness at yesterday's dinner, but not time to make my answer when I saw Sergeant Cuff's eyes suddenly turn aside towards the shrubbery, and I heard him say softly to himself, "Hello!" "What's the matter?" I asked. "A touch of rheumatics in my back," said the sergeant in a loud voice, as if he wanted some third person to hear us. "We shall have a change in the weather before long." A few steps further brought us to the corner of the house. Turning off sharp to the right, we entered on the terrace, and went down by the steps in the middle into the garden below. Sergeant Cuff stopped there in the open space, where we could see round us on every side. "About that young person, Rosanna Spearman," he said. "It isn't very likely, with her personal appearance, that she has got a lover, but for the girl's own sake I must ask you at once whether she has provided herself with a sweetheart, poor wretch, like the rest of them?" What on earth did he mean, under present circumstances, by putting such a question to me as that? I stared at him, instead of answering him. "I saw Rosanna Spearman hiding in the shrubbery as we went by," said the sergeant. "When you said 'Hullo'?" "Yes, when I said 'Hullo.' If there's a sweetheart in the case, the hiding doesn't much matter. If there isn't, as things are in this house, the hiding is a highly suspicious circumstance, and it will be my painful duty to act on it accordingly." What in God's name was I to say to him? I knew the shrubbery was Mr. Franklin's favourite walk. I knew he would most likely turn that way when he came back from the station. I knew that Penelope had over and over again caught her fellow servant hanging about there, and had always declared to me that Rosanna's object was to attract Mr. Franklin's attention. If my daughter was right, she might well have been lying in wait for Mr. Franklin's return when the sergeant noticed her. I was put between the two difficulties of mentioning Penelope's fanciful notion as if it was mine, or of leaving an unfortunate creature to suffer the consequences, the very serious consequences, of exciting the suspicion of Sergeant Cuff. Out of pure pity for the girl, on my soul and on my character, out of pure pity for the girl, I gave the sergeant the necessary explanations, and told him that Rosanna had been mad enough to set her heart on Mr. Franklin Blake. Sergeant Cuff never laughed. On the few occasions when anything amused him, he curled up a little at the corners of the lips, nothing more. He curled up now. "Hadn't you better say she's mad enough to be an ugly girl and only a servant?" he asked. "The falling in love with a gentleman of Mr. Franklin Blake's manners and appearance doesn't seem to me to be the maddest part of her conduct by any means. However, I'm glad the thing is cleared up. It relieves one's mind to have things cleared up. Yes, I'll keep it a secret, Mr. Betteredge. I like to be tender to human infirmity, though I don't get many chances of exercising that virtue in my line of life. You think Mr. Franklin Blake hasn't got a suspicion of the girl's fancy for him? Ah! He would have found it out fast enough if she had been nice-looking. The ugly women have a bad time of it in this world. Let's hope it will be made up to them in another. You have got a nice garden here, and a well-kept lawn. See for yourself how much better the flowers look with grass about them instead of gravel. No, thank you, I won't take a rose. It goes to my heart to break them off the stem. Just as it goes to your heart, you know, when there's something wrong in the servants' hall. Did you notice anything you couldn't account for in any of the servants when the loss of the diamond was first found out?" I had got on very fairly well with Sergeant Cuff so far, but the slyness with which he slipped in that last question put me on my guard. In plain English, I didn't at all relish the notion of helping his inquiries, when those inquiries took him, in the capacity of snake in the grass, among my fellow servants. "I noticed nothing," I said, "except that we all lost our heads together, myself included." "Oh," says the sergeant, "that's all you have to tell me, is it?" I answered with, as I flattered myself, an unmoved countenance, "That is all." Sergeant Cuff's dismal eyes looked me hard in the face. "Mr. Betteredge," he said, "have you any objection to oblige me by shaking hands? I have taken an extraordinary liking to you." Why he should have chosen the exact moment when I was deceiving him to give me that proof of his good opinion is beyond all comprehension. I felt a little proud. I really did feel a little proud of having been one too many at last for the celebrated Cuff. We went back to the house, the sergeant requesting that I would give him a room to himself, and then send in the servants, the indoor servants only, one after another in the order of their rank from first to last. I showed Sergeant Cuff into my own room, and then called the servants together in the hall. Rosanna Spearman appeared among them much as usual. She was as quick in her way as the sergeant in his, and I suspect she had heard what he said to me about the servants in general just before he discovered her. There she was, at any rate, looking as if she had never heard of such a place as the shrubbery in her life. I sent them in one by one as desired. The cook was the first to enter the Court of Justice, otherwise my room. She remained but a short time. Report on coming out: "Sergeant Cuff is depressed in his spirits, but Sergeant Cuff is a perfect gentleman." My lady's own maid followed. Remained much longer. Report on coming out: "If Sergeant Cuff doesn't believe a respectable woman, he might keep his opinion to himself at any rate." Penelope went next. Remained only a minute or two. Report on coming out: "Sergeant Cuff is much to be pitied. He must have been crossed in love, father, when he was a young man." The first housemaid followed Penelope. Remained, like my lady's maid, a long time. Report on coming out: "I didn't enter her ladyship's service, Mr. Betteredge, to be doubted to my face by a low police officer." Rosanna Spearman went next. Remained longer than any of them. No report on coming out. Dead silence, and lips as pale as ashes. Samuel, the footman, followed Rosanna. Remained a minute or two. Report on coming out: "Whoever blacked Sergeant Cuff's boots ought to be ashamed of himself." Nancy, the kitchen maid, went last. Remained a minute or two. Report on coming out: "Sergeant Cuff has a heart. He doesn't cut jokes, Mr. Betteredge, with a poor hard-working girl." Going into the Court of Justice, when it was all over, to hear if there were any further commands for me, I found the sergeant at his old trick looking out of the window and whistling "The Last Rose of Summer" to himself. "Any discoveries, sir?" I inquired. "If Rosanna Spearman asks leave to go out," said the sergeant, "let the poor thing go, but let me know first." I might as well have held my tongue about Rosanna and Mr. Franklin. It was plain enough the unfortunate girl had fallen under Sergeant Cuff's suspicions, in spite of all I could do to prevent it. "I hope you don't think Rosanna is concerned in the loss of the diamond?" I ventured to say. The corners of the sergeant's melancholy mouth curled up, and he looked hard in my face, just as he had looked in the garden. "I think I had better not tell you, Mr. Betteredge," he said. "You might lose your head, you know, for the second time." I began to doubt whether I had been one too many for the celebrated Cuff, after all. It was rather a relief to me that we were interrupted here by a knock at the door, and a message from the cook. Rosanna Spearman had asked to go out for the usual reason, that her head was bad and she wanted a breath of fresh air. At a sign from the sergeant I said yes. "Which is the servants' way out?" he asked, when the messenger had gone. I showed him the servants' way out. "Lock the door of your room," says the sergeant, "and if anybody asks for me, say I'm in there composing my mind." He curled up again at the corners of the lips and disappeared. Left alone under these circumstances, a devouring curiosity pushed me on to make some discoveries for myself. It was plain that Sergeant Cuff's suspicions of Rosanna had been roused by something that he had found out at his examination of the servants in my room. Now the only two servants, excepting Rosanna herself, who had remained under examination for any length of time, were my lady's own maid and the first housemaid, those two being also the women who had taken the lead in persecuting their unfortunate fellow servant from the first. Reaching these conclusions, I looked in on them, casually as it might be, in the servants' hall, and, finding tea going forward, instantly invited myself to that meal. For, nota bene, a drop of tea is to a woman's tongue what a drop of oil is to a wasting lamp. My reliance on the teapot as an ally did not go unrewarded. In less than half an hour I knew as much as the sergeant himself. My lady's maid and the housemaid had, it appeared, neither of them believed in Rosanna's illness of the previous day. These two devils, I ask your pardon, but how else can you describe a couple of spiteful women, had stolen upstairs at intervals during the Thursday afternoon, had tried Rosanna's door and found it locked, had knocked and had not been answered, had listened and not heard a word inside. When the girl had come down to tea and had been sent up, still out of sorts, to bed again, the two devils aforesaid had tried her door once more and found it locked, had looked in the keyhole and found it stopped up, had seen a light under the door at midnight, and had heard the crackling of a fire in a servant's bedroom in the month of June, at 4 in the morning. All this they had told Sergeant Cuff, who, in return for their anxiety to enlighten him, had eyed them with sour and suspicious looks, and had shown them plainly that he didn't believe either one or the other. Hence the unfavourable reports of him which these two women had brought out with them from the examination. Hence also, without reckoning the influence of the teapot, their readiness to let their tongues run to any length on the subject of the sergeant's ungracious behaviour to them. Having had some experience of the great Cuff's roundabout ways, and having last seen him evidently bent on following Rosanna privately when she went out for her walk, it seemed clear to me that he had thought it unadvisable to let the lady's maid and the housemaid know how materially they had helped him. They were just the sort of women, if he had treated their evidence as trustworthy, to have been puffed up by it, and to have said or done something which would have put Rosanna Spearman on her guard. I walked out in the fine summer afternoon, very sorry for the poor girl, and very uneasy in my mind at the turn things had taken. Drifting towards the shrubbery, some time later, there I met Mr. Franklin. After returning from seeing his cousin off at the station, he had been with my lady, holding a long conversation with her. She had told him of Miss Rachel's unaccountable refusal to let her wardrobe be examined, and had put him in such low spirits about my young lady that he seemed to shrink from speaking on the subject. The family temper appeared in his face that evening for the first time in my experience of him. "Well, Betteridge," he said, "how does the atmosphere of mystery and suspicion in which we are all living now agree with you? Do you remember that morning when I first came here with the Moonstone? I wish to God we had thrown it into the quicksand." After breaking out in that way, he abstained from speaking again until he had composed himself. We walked silently, side by side, for a minute or two, and then he asked me what had become of Sergeant Cuff. It was impossible to put Mr. Franklin off with the excuse of the sergeant being in my room, composing his mind. I told him exactly what had happened, mentioning particularly what my lady's maid and the housemaid had said about Rosanna Spearman. Mr. Franklin's clear head saw the turn the sergeant's suspicion had taken in the twinkling of an eye. "Didn't you tell me this morning," he said, "that one of the tradespeople declared he had met Rosanna yesterday on the footway to Frizinghall, when we supposed her to be ill in her room?" "Yes, sir. If my aunt's maid and the other woman have spoken the truth, you may depend upon it the tradesman did meet her. The girl's attack of illness was a blind to deceive us. She had some guilty reason for going to the town secretly. The paint-stained dress is a dress of hers, and the fire heard crackling in her room at 4 in the morning was a fire lit to destroy it. Rosanna Spearman has stolen the diamond. I'll go in directly and tell my aunt the turn things have taken." "Not just yet, if you please, sir," said a melancholy voice behind us. We both turned about, and found ourselves face to face with Sergeant Cuff. "Why not just yet?" asked Mr. Franklin. "Because, sir, if you tell her ladyship will tell Miss Verinder." "Suppose she does? What then?" Mr. Franklin said those words with a sudden heat and vehemence, as if the sergeant had mortally offended him. "Do you think it's wise, sir," said Sergeant Cuff quietly, "to put such a question as that to me, at such a time as this?" There was a moment's silence between them. Mr. Franklin walked close up to the sergeant. The two looked each other straight in the face. Mr. Franklin spoke first, dropping his voice as suddenly as he had raised it. "I suppose you know, Mr. Cuff," he said, "that you are treading on delicate ground?" "It isn't the first time, by a good many hundreds, that I find myself treading on delicate ground," answered the other, as immovable as ever. "Am I to understand that you forbid me to tell my aunt what has happened?" "You are to understand, if you please, sir, that I throw up the case if you tell Lady Verinder, or tell anybody what has happened, until I give you leave. That settled it. Mr. Franklin had no choice but to submit. He turned away in anger and left us. I had stood there listening to them, all in a tremble, not knowing whom to suspect or what to think next. In the midst of my confusion, two things, however, were plain to me. First, that my young lady was, in some unaccountable manner, at the bottom of the sharp speeches which had passed between them. Second, that they thoroughly understood each other, without having previously exchanged a word of explanation on either side. "Mr. Betteredge," says the sergeant, "you have done a very foolish thing in my absence. You have done a little detective business on your own account. For the future, perhaps you will be so obliging as to do your detective business along with me." He took me by the arm, and walked me away with him along the road by which he had come. I dare say I had deserved his reproof, but I was not going to help him to set traps for Rosanna Spearman for all that. Thief or no thief, legal or not legal, I don't care. I pitied her. "What do you want of me?" I asked, shaking him off and stopping short. "Only a little information about the country round here," said the sergeant. I couldn't well object to improve Sergeant Cuff in his geography. "Is there any path in that direction leading to the sea beach from this house?" asked the sergeant. He pointed as he spoke to the fir plantation which led to the Shivering Sand. "Yes," I said, "there is a path." "Show it to me." Side by side in the grey of the summer evening, Sergeant Cuff and I set forth for the Shivering Sand. Chapter 14. The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 15. The sergeant remained silent, thinking his own thoughts, till we entered the plantation of firs which led to the quicksand. There he roused himself, like a man whose mind was made up, and spoke to me again. "Mr. Betteredge," he said, "as you have honoured me by taking an oar in my boat, and as you may, I think, be of some assistance to me before the evening is out, I see no use in our mystifying one another any longer, and I propose to set you an example of plain speaking on my side. You are determined to give me no information to the prejudice of Rosanna Spearman, because she has been a good girl to you, and because you pity her heartily. Those humane considerations do you a world of credit, but they happen in this instance to be humane considerations clean thrown away. Rosanna Spearman is not in the slightest danger of getting into trouble, no, not if I fix her with being concerned in the disappearance of the diamond, on evidence which is as plain as the nose on your face." "Do you mean that my lady won't prosecute?" I asked. "I mean that your lady can't prosecute," said the sergeant. "Rosanna Spearman is simply an instrument in the hands of another person, and Rosanna Spearman will be held harmless for that person's sake." He spoke like a man in earnest, there was no denying that. Still, I felt something stirring uneasily against him in my mind. "Can't you give that other person a name?" I said. "Can't you, Mr. Betteredge?" "No." Sergeant Cuff stood stock still and surveyed me with a look of melancholy interest. "It's always a pleasure to me to be tender towards human infirmity," he said. "I feel particularly tender at the present moment, Mr. Betteredge, towards you. And you, with the same excellent motive, feel particularly tender towards Rosanna Spearman, don't you? Do you happen to know whether she has had a new outfit of linen lately?" What he meant by slipping in this extraordinary question unawares, I was at a total loss to imagine. Seeing no possible injury to Rosanna if I owned the truth, I answered that the girl had come to us rather sparely provided with linen, and that my lady, in recompense for her good conduct, I laid a stress on her good conduct, had given her a new outfit not a fortnight since. "This is a miserable world," says the sergeant. "Human life, Mr. Betteredge, is a sort of target. Misfortune is always firing at it, and always hitting the mark. But for that outfit we should have discovered a new nightgown or petticoat among Rosanna's things, and have nailed her in that way. You're not at a loss to follow me, are you? You have examined the servants yourself, and you know what discoveries two of them made outside Rosanna's door. Surely you know what the girl was about yesterday after she was taken ill? You can't guess? Oh, dear me, it's as plain as that strip of light there at the end of the trees. At 11 on Thursday morning, Superintendent Seagrave, who is a mass of human infirmity, points out to all the women servants the smear on the door. Rosanna has her own reasons for suspecting her own things. She takes the first opportunity of getting to her room, finds the paint stain on her nightgown or petticoat or what not, shams ill, and slips away to the town, gets the materials for making a new petticoat or nightgown, makes it alone in her room. On the Thursday night lights a fire, not to destroy it. 2 of her fellow servants are prying outside her door, and she knows better than to make a smell of burning, and to have a lot of tinder to get rid of. Lights a fire, I say, to dry and iron the substitute dress after wringing it out, keeps the stained dress hidden, probably on her, and is at this moment occupied in making away with it in some convenient place on that lonely bit of beach ahead of us. I have traced her this evening to your fishing village, and to one particular cottage, which we may possibly have to visit before we go back. She stopped in the cottage for some time, and she came out with, as I believe, something hidden under her cloak. A cloak, on a woman's back, is an emblem of charity. It covers a multitude of sins. I saw her set off northwards along the coast, after leaving the cottage. Is your seashore here considered a fine specimen of marine landscape, Mr. Betteredge? I answered, yes, as shortly as might be. Tastes differ, says Sergeant Cuff. Looking at it from my point of view, I never saw a marine landscape that I admired less. If you happen to be following another person along your sea-coast, and if that person happens to look round, there isn't a scrap of cover to hide you anywhere. I had to choose between taking Rosanna in custody on suspicion, or leaving her, for the time being, with her little game in her own hands. For reasons which I won't trouble you with, I decided on making any sacrifice rather than give the alarm as soon as tonight to a certain person who will be nameless between us. I came back to the house to ask you to take me to the north end of the beach by another way. Sand, in respect of its printing off people's footsteps, is one of the best detective officers I know. If we don't meet with Rosanna Spearman by coming round on her in this way, the sand may tell us where she has been at, if the light only lasts long enough. Here is the sand. If you will excuse my suggesting it, suppose you hold your tongue, and let me go first. If there is such a thing known at the doctor's shop as a detective fever, that disease had now got fast hold of your humble servant. Sergeant Cuff went on between the hillocks of sand down to the beach. I followed him, with my heart in my mouth, and waited at a little distance for what was to happen next. As it turned out, I found myself standing nearly in the same place where Rosanna Spearman and I had been talking together when Mr. Franklin suddenly appeared before us, on arriving at our house from London. While my eyes were watching the sergeant, my mind wandered away in spite of me to what had passed on that former occasion between Rosanna and me. I declare I almost felt the poor thing slip her hand again into mine and give it a little grateful squeeze to thank me for speaking kindly to her. I declare I almost heard her voice telling me again that the shivering sand seemed to draw her to it against her own will whenever she went out, almost saw her face brighten again as it brightened when she first set eyes upon Mr. Franklin coming briskly out on us from among the hillocks. My spirits fell lower and lower as I thought of these things, and the view of the lonesome little bay, when I looked about to rouse myself, only served to make me feel more uneasy still. The last of the evening light was fading away, and over all the desolate place there hung a still and awful calm. The heave of the main ocean on the great sandbank out in the bay was a heave that made no sound. The inner sea lay lost and dim, without a breath of wind to stir it. Patches of nasty ooze floated, yellow-white, on the dead surface of the water. Scum and slime shone faintly in certain places, where the last of the light still caught them on the 2 great spits of rock jutting out, north and south, into the sea. It was now the time of the turn of the tide, and even as I stood there waiting, the broad brown face of the quicksand began to dimple and quiver, the only moving thing in all the horrid place. I saw the sergeant start as the shiver of the sand caught his eye. After looking at it for a minute or so, he turned and came back to me. "A treacherous place, Mr. Betteredge," he said, "and no signs of Rosanna Spearman anywhere on the beach, look where you may." He took me down lower on the shore, and I saw for myself that his footsteps and mine were the only footsteps printed off on the sand. "How does the fishing village bear, standing where we are now?" asked Sergeant Cuff. "Cobb's Hole," I answered, that being the name of the place, "bears as near as may be, due south." "I saw the girl this evening, walking northward along the shore, from Cobb's Hole," said the sergeant. "Consequently, she must have been walking towards this place. Is Cobb's Hole on the other side of that point of land there? And can we get to it, now it's low water, by the beach?" I answered yes, to both those questions. "If you'll excuse my suggesting it, we'll step out briskly," said the sergeant. "I want to find the place where she left the shore before it gets dark." We had walked, I should say, a couple of 100 yards towards Cobb's Hole, when Sergeant Cuff suddenly went down on his knees on the beach, to all appearance seized with a sudden frenzy for saying his prayers. "There's something to be said for your marine landscape here, after all," remarked the sergeant. "Here are a woman's footsteps, Mr. Betteredge. Let us call them Rosanna's footsteps, until we find evidence to the contrary that we can't resist. Very confused footsteps, you will please to observe, purposely confused, I should say. Ah, poor soul, she understands the detective virtues of sand as well as I do. But hasn't she been in rather too great a hurry to tread out the marks thoroughly? I think she has. Here's one footstep going from Cobb's Hole, and here is another going back to it. Isn't that the toe of her shoe pointing straight to the water's edge? And don't I see 2 heel marks further down the beach, close at the water's edge also? I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm afraid Rosanna is sly. It looks as if she had determined to get to that place you and I have just come from, without leaving any marks on the sand to trace her by. Shall we say that she walked through the water from this point till she got to that ledge of rocks behind us, and came back the same way, and then took to the beach again, where those 2 heel marks are still left? Yes, we'll say that. It seems to fit in with my notion that she had something under her cloak when she left the cottage. No, not something to destroy, for in that case where would have been the need for all these preparations to prevent my tracing the place at which her walk ended? Something to hide is, I think, the better guess of the 2. Perhaps, if we go on to the cottage, we may find out what that something is. At this proposal my detective fever suddenly cooled. "You don't want me," I said. "What good can I do?" "The longer I know you, Mr. Betteredge," said the sergeant, "the more virtues I discover. Modesty, oh dear me, how rare modesty is in this world, and how much of that rarity you possess. If I go alone to the cottage, the people's tongues will be tied at the first question I put to them. If I go with you, I go introduced by a justly respected neighbour, and a flow of conversation is the necessary result. It strikes me in that light. How does it strike you?" Not having an answer of the needful smartness as ready as I could have wished, I tried to gain time by asking him which cottage he wanted to go to. On the sergeant describing the place, I recognized it as a cottage inhabited by a fisherman named Yolland, with his wife and 2 grown-up children, a son and a daughter. If you will look back, you will find that, in first presenting Rosanna Spearman to your notice, I have described her as occasionally varying her walk to the shivering sand by a visit to some friends of hers at Cobb's Hole. Those friends were the Yollands, respectable, worthy people, a credit to the neighbourhood. Rosanna's acquaintance with them had begun by means of the daughter, who was afflicted with a misshapen foot, and who was known in our parts by the name of Limping Lucy. The 2 deformed girls had, I suppose, a kind of fellow-feeling for each other. Anyway, the Yollands and Rosanna always appeared to get on together, at the few chances they had of meeting, in a pleasant and friendly manner. The fact of Sergeant Cuff having traced the girl to their cottage set the matter of my helping his inquiries in quite a new light. Rosanna had merely gone where she was in the habit of going, and to show that she had been in company with the fisherman and his family was as good as to prove that she had been innocently occupied, so far at any rate. It would be doing the girl a service, therefore, instead of an injury, if I allowed myself to be convinced by Sergeant Cuff's logic. I professed myself convinced by it accordingly. We went on to Cobb's Hole, seeing the footsteps on the sand as long as the light lasted. On reaching the cottage, the fisherman and his son proved to be out in the boat, and Limping Lucy, always weak and weary, was resting on her bed upstairs. Good Mrs. Yolland received us alone in her kitchen. When she heard that Sergeant Cuff was a celebrated character in London, she clapped a bottle of Dutch gin and a couple of clean pipes on the table, and stared as if she could never see enough of him. I sat quiet in a corner, waiting to hear how the sergeant would find his way to the subject of Rosanna Spearman. His usual roundabout manner of going to work proved, on this occasion, to be more roundabout than ever. How he managed it is more than I could tell at the time, and more than I can tell now. But this is certain, he began with the royal family, the primitive Methodists, and the price of fish, and he got from that, in his dismal underground way, to the loss of the Moonstone, the spitefulness of our first housemaid, and the hard behaviour of the women servants generally towards Rosanna Spearman. Having reached his subject in this fashion, he described himself as making his inquiries about the lost diamond, partly with a view to find it, and partly for the purpose of clearing Rosanna from the unjust suspicions of her enemies in the house. In about a quarter of an hour from the time when we entered the kitchen, good Mrs. Yolland was persuaded that she was talking to Rosanna's best friend, and was pressing Sergeant Cuff to comfort his stomach and revive his spirits out of the Dutch bottle. Being firmly persuaded that the sergeant was wasting his breath to no purpose on Mrs. Yolland, I sat enjoying the talk between them, much as I have sat in my time enjoying a stage play. The great Cuff showed a wonderful patience, trying his luck drearily this way and that way, and firing shot after shot, as it were, at random, on the chance of hitting the mark. Everything to Rosanna's credit, nothing to Rosanna's prejudice. That was how it ended, try as he might, with Mrs. Yolland talking 19 to the dozen, and placing the most entire confidence in him. His last effort was made when we had looked at our watches, and had got on our legs previous to taking leave. "I shall now wish you good night, ma'am," says the sergeant, "and I shall only say at parting that Rosanna Spearman has a sincere well-wisher in myself, your obedient servant. But, oh dear me, she will never get on in her present place, and my advice to her is, leave it." "Bless your heart alive, she is going to leave it," cries Mrs. Yolland. Nota bene, I translate Mrs. Yolland out of the Yorkshire language into the English language, when I tell you that the all-accomplished Cuff was every now and then puzzled to understand her until I helped him. You will draw your own conclusions as to what your state of mind would be if I reported her in her native tongue. Rosanna Spearman going to leave us? I pricked up my ears at that. It seemed strange, to say the least of it, that she should have given no warning, in the first place, to my lady or to me. A certain doubt came up in my mind whether Sergeant Cuff's last random shot might not have hit the mark. I began to question whether my share in the proceedings was quite as harmless a one as I had thought it. It might be all in the way of the sergeant's business to mystify an honest woman by wrapping her round in a network of lies, but it was my duty to have remembered, as a good Protestant, that the father of lies is the devil, and that mischief and the devil are never far apart. Beginning to smell mischief in the air, I tried to take Sergeant Cuff out. He sat down again instantly, and asked for a little drop of comfort out of the Dutch bottle. Mrs. Yolland sat down opposite to him, and gave him his nip. I went on to the door, excessively uncomfortable, and said I thought I must bid them good night, and yet I didn't go. "So she means to leave?" says the sergeant. "What is she to do when she does leave? Sad, sad! The poor creature has got no friends in the world, except you and me." "Ah, but she has, though," says Mrs. Yolland. "She came in here, as I told you, this evening, and after sitting and talking a little with my girl Lucy and me, she asked to go upstairs by herself into Lucy's room. It's the only room in our place where there's pen and ink. 'I want to write a letter to a friend,' she says, 'and I can't do it for the prying and peeping of the servants up at the house.' Who the letter was written to I can't tell you. It must have been a mortal long one, judging by the time she stopped upstairs over it. I offered her a postage stamp when she came down. She hadn't got the letter in her hand, and she didn't accept the stamp. A little close, poor soul, as you know, about herself and her doings. But a friend she has got somewhere, I can tell you, and to that friend you may depend upon it she will go." "Soon?" asked the sergeant. "As soon as she can," says Mrs. Yolland. Here I stepped in again from the door. As chief of my lady's establishment, I couldn't allow this sort of loose talk about a servant of ours going, or not going, to proceed any longer in my presence, without noticing it. "You must be mistaken about Rosanna Spearman," I said. "If she had been going to leave her present situation, she would have mentioned it, in the first place, to me." "Mistaken?" cries Mrs. Yolland. "Why, only an hour ago she brought some things she wanted for travelling, of my own self, Mr. Betteridge, in this very room. And that reminds me," says the wearisome woman, suddenly beginning to feel in her pocket, "of something I have got it on my mind to say about Rosanna and her money. Are you either of you likely to see her when you go back to the house?" "I'll take a message to the poor thing with the greatest pleasure," answered Sergeant Cuff, before I could put in a word edgewise. Mrs. Yolland produced out of her pocket a few shillings and sixpences, and counted them out with the most particular and exasperating carefulness in the palm of her hand. She offered the money to the sergeant, looking mighty loath to part with it all the while. "Might I ask you to give this back to Rosanna with my love and respects?" says Mrs. Yolland. "She insisted on paying me for the one or two things she took a fancy to this evening, and money's welcome enough in our house, I don't deny it, Still, I'm not easy in my mind about taking the poor thing's little savings, and to tell you the truth, I don't think my man would like to hear that I had taken Rosanna Spearman's money when he comes back tomorrow morning from his work. Please say she's heartily welcome to the things she bought of me as a gift. And don't leave the money on the table, says Mrs. Yolland, putting it down suddenly before the sergeant, as if it burnt her fingers. Don't, there's a good man, for times are hard and flesh is weak, and I might be tempted to put it back in my pocket again. Come along, I said. I can't wait any longer. I must go back to the house. I'll follow you directly, says Sergeant Cuff. For the second time I went to the door, and for the second time, try as I might, I couldn't cross the threshold. It's a delicate matter, ma'am, I heard the sergeant say, giving money back. You charged her cheap for the things, I'm sure. Cheap, says Mrs. Yolland. Come and judge for yourself. She took up the candle and led the sergeant to a corner of the kitchen. For the life of me I couldn't help following them. Shaken down in the corner was a heap of odds and ends, mostly old metal, which the fisherman had picked up at different times from wrecked ships, and which he hadn't found a market for yet, to his own mind. Mrs. Yolland dived into this rubbish, and brought up an old japanned tin case, with a cover to it, and a hasp to hang it up, by the sort of thing they use on board ship, for keeping their maps and charts and such like from the wet. There, she says, when Rosanna came in this evening, she bought the fellow to that. It will just do, she says, to put my cuffs and collars in, and keep them from being crumpled in my box. 1 and 9pence, Mr. Cuff, as I live by bread, not a halfpenny more. Dirt cheap, says the sergeant, with a heavy sigh. He weighed the case in his hand. I thought I heard a note or two of the last rose of summer as he looked at it. There was no doubt now. He had made another discovery to the prejudice of Rosanna Spearman, in the place of all others where I thought her character was safest, and all through me. I leave you to imagine what I felt, and how sincerely I repented having been the medium of introduction between Mrs. Yolland and Sergeant Cuff. That will do, I said. We really must go. Without paying the least attention to me, Mrs. Yolland took another dive into the rubbish, and came up out of it this time with a dog chain. Weigh it in your hand, sir, she said to the sergeant. We had 3 of these, and Rosanna has taken 2 of them. What can you want, my dear, with a couple of dogs' chains? Says I. If I join them together, they'll do round my box nicely, says she. Rope's cheapest, says I. Chains surest, says she. Who ever heard of a box corded with chain? Says I. Oh, Mrs. Yolland, don't make objections, says she. Let me have my chains. A strange girl, Mr. Cuff, good as gold, and kinder than a sister to my Lucy, but always a little strange. There, I humoured her. 3 and 6pence. On the word of an honest woman, 3 and 6pence, Mr. Cuff. Each, says the sergeant. Both together, says Mrs. Yolland. 3 and 6pence for the 2. Given away, ma'am, says the sergeant, shaking his head. Clean given away. There's the money, says Mrs. Yolland, getting back sideways to the little heap of silver on the table, as if it drew her in spite of herself. The tin case and the dog chains were all she bought, and all she took away. 1 and 9pence, and 3 and 6pence total, 5 and 3. With my love and respects, and I can't find it in my conscience to take a poor girl's savings when she may want them herself. I can't find it in my conscience, ma'am, to give the money back, says Sergeant Cuff. You have as good as made her a present of the things. You have indeed. Is that your sincere opinion, sir? says Mrs. Yolland, brightening up wonderfully. There can't be a doubt about it, answered the sergeant. Ask Mr. Betteredge. It was no use asking me. All they got out of me was good night. Bother the money, says Mrs. Yolland. With these words she appeared to lose all command over herself, and making a sudden snatch at the heap of silver, put it back holus bolus in her pocket. It upsets one's temper, it does, to see it lying there, and nobody taking it, cries this unreasonable woman, sitting down with a thump, and looking at Sergeant Cuff as much as to say, It's in my pocket again now. Get it out if you can. This time I not only went to the door, but went fairly out on the road back. Explain it how you may, I felt as if one or both of them had mortally offended me. Before I had taken 3 steps down the village, I heard the sergeant behind me. Thank you for your introduction, Mr. Betteredge, he said. I am indebted to the fisherman's wife for an entirely new sensation. Mrs. Yolland has puzzled me. It was on the tip of my tongue to have given him a sharp answer, for no better reason than this, that I was out of temper with him, because I was out of temper with myself. But when he owned to being puzzled, a comforting doubt crossed my mind whether any great harm had been done after all. I waited in discreet silence to hear more. "Yes," says the sergeant, as if he was actually reading my thoughts in the dark. "Instead of putting me on the scent, it may console you to know, Mr. Betteredge, with your interest in Rosanna, that you have been the means of throwing me off. What the girl has done to-night is clear enough, of course. She has joined the two chains, and has fastened them to the hasp in the tin case. She has sunk the case in the water or in the quicksand. She has made the loose end of the chain fast to some place under the rocks, known only to herself, and she will leave the case secure at its anchorage till the present proceedings have come to an end, after which she can privately pull it up again out of its hiding place at her own leisure and convenience. All perfectly plain so far. But," says the sergeant, with the first tone of impatience in his voice that I had heard yet, "the mystery is, what the devil has she hidden in the tin case?" I thought to myself, the Moonstone, but I only said to Sergeant Cuff, "Can't you guess?" "It's not the diamond," said Sergeant. "The whole experience of my life is at fault if Rosanna Spearman has got the diamond." On hearing those words the infernal detective fever began, I suppose, to burn in me again. At any rate, I forgot myself in the interest of guessing this new riddle. I said rashly, "The stained dress!" Sergeant Cuff stopped short in the dark and laid his hand on my arm. "Is anything thrown in that quicksand of yours ever thrown up on the surface again?" he asked. "Never," I answered. "Light or heavy, whatever goes into the shivering sand is sucked down and seen no more." "Does Rosanna Spearman know that?" "She knows it as well as I do." "Then," says the sergeant, "what on earth has she got to do but to tie up a bit of stone in the stained dress and throw it into the quicksand? There isn't the shadow of a reason why she should have hidden it, and yet she must have hidden it. Query," says the sergeant, walking on again, "is the paint-stained dress a petticoat or a nightgown? Or is it something else which there is a reason for preserving at any risk? Mr. Betteredge, if nothing occurs to prevent it, I must go to Frizinghall to-morrow and discover what she bought in the town, when she privately got the materials for making the substitute dress. It's a risk to leave the house as things are now, but it's a worse risk still to stir another step in this matter in the dark. Excuse my being a little out of temper. I'm degraded in my own estimation. I have let Rosanna Spearman puzzle me." When we got back, the servants were at supper. The first person we saw in the outer yard was the policeman whom Superintendent Seagrave had left at the sergeant's disposal. The sergeant asked if Rosanna Spearman had returned. Yes. When? Nearly an hour since. What had she done? She had gone upstairs to take off her bonnet and cloak, and she was now at supper quietly with the rest. Without making any remark, Sergeant Cuff walked on, sinking lower and lower in his own estimation, to the back of the house. Missing the entrance in the dark, he went on, in spite of my calling to him, till he was stopped by a wicket gate which led into the garden. When I joined him to bring him back by the right way, I found that he was looking up attentively at one particular window, on the bedroom floor at the back of the house. Looking up in my turn, I discovered that the object of his contemplation was the window of Miss Rachel's room, and that lights were passing backwards and forwards there as if something unusual was going on. "Isn't that Miss Verender's room?" asked Sergeant Cuff. I replied that it was, and invited him to go in with me to supper. The sergeant remained in his place and said something about enjoying the smell of the garden at night. I left him to his enjoyment. Just as I was turning in at the door, I heard "The Last Rose of Summer" at the wicket gate. Sergeant Cuff had made another discovery, and my young lady's window was at the bottom of it this time. The latter reflection took me back again to the sergeant, with a polite intimation that I could not find it in my heart to leave him by himself. "Is there anything you don't understand up there?" I added, pointing to Miss Rachel's window. Judging by his voice, Sergeant Cuff had suddenly risen again to the right place in his own estimation. "You are great people for betting in Yorkshire, are you not?" he asked. "Well," I said, "suppose we are." "If I was a Yorkshireman," proceeded the sergeant, taking my arm, "I would lay you an even sovereign, Mr. Betteredge, that your young lady has suddenly resolved to leave the house. If I won on that event, I should offer to lay another sovereign that the idea has occurred to her within the last hour." The first of the sergeant's guesses startled me. The second mixed itself up somehow in my head with the report we had heard from the policeman that Rosanna Spearman had returned from the sands within the last hour. The two together had a curious effect on me as we went into supper. I shook off Sergeant Cuff's arm, and forgetting my manners, pushed by him through the door to make my own inquiries for myself. Samuel, the footman, was the first person I met in the passage. "Her ladyship is waiting to see you and Sergeant Cuff," he said, before I could put any questions to him. "How long has she been waiting?" asked the sergeant's voice behind me. "For the last hour, sir." There it was again. Rosanna had come back, Miss Rachel had taken some resolution out of the common, and my lady had been waiting to see the sergeant all within the last hour. It was not pleasant to find these very different persons and things linking themselves together in this way. I went on upstairs without looking at Sergeant Cuff or speaking to him. My hand took a sudden fit of trembling as I lifted it to knock at my mistress's door. "I shouldn't be surprised," whispered the sergeant over my shoulder, "if a scandal was to burst up in the house to-night. Don't be alarmed. I have put the muzzle on worse family difficulties than this in my time." As he said the words, I heard my mistress's voice calling us to come in. End of chapter 15. The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 16. We found my lady with no light in the room but the reading lamp. The shade was screwed down so as to overshadow her face. Instead of looking up at us in her usual straightforward way, she sat close at the table, and kept her eyes fixed obstinately on an open book. "Officer," she said, "is it important to the inquiry you are conducting to know beforehand if any person now in this house wishes to leave it?" "Most important, my lady." "I have to tell you, then, that Miss Verinder proposes to stay with her aunt, Mrs. Applewhite, of Frizinghall. She has arranged to leave us the first thing to-morrow morning." Sergeant Cuff looked at me. I made a step forward as to speak to my mistress, and, feeling my heart fail me, if I must own it, took a step back again, and said nothing. "May I ask your ladyship when Miss Verinder informed you that she was going to her aunt's?" inquired the sergeant. "About an hour since," answered my mistress. Sergeant Cuff looked at me once more. They say old people's hearts are not very easily moved. My heart couldn't have thumped much harder than it did now, if I had been 25 again. "I have no claim, my lady," says the sergeant, "to control Miss Verinder's actions. All I can ask you to do is to put off her departure, if possible, till later in the day. I must go to Frizinghall myself to-morrow morning, and I shall be back by 2 o'clock, if not before. If Miss Verinder can be kept here till that time, I should wish to say 2 words to her unexpectedly before she goes." My lady directed me to give the coachman her orders, that the carriage was not to come for Miss Rachel until 2 o'clock. "Have you more to say?" she asked of the sergeant, when this had been done. "Only one more thing, your ladyship. If Miss Verinder is surprised at this change in the arrangements, please not to mention me as being the cause of putting off her journey." My mistress lifted her head suddenly from her book, as if she was going to say something, checked herself by a great effort, and, looking back again at the open page, dismissed us with a sign of her hand. "That's a wonderful woman," said Sergeant Cuff when we were out in the hall again. "But for her self-control, the mystery that puzzles you, Mr. Betteredge, would have been at an end to-night." At those words the truth rushed at last into my stupid old head. For a moment, I suppose, I must have gone clear out of my senses. I seized the sergeant by the collar of his coat and pinned him against the wall. "Damn you!" I cried. "There's something wrong about Miss Rachel, and you have been hiding it from me all the time." Sergeant Cuff looked up at me, flat against the wall, without stirring a hand, or moving a muscle of his melancholy face. "Ah!" he said, "you've guessed it at last." My hand dropped from his collar, and my head sunk on my breast. Please to remember, as some excuse for my breaking out as I did, that I had served the family for 50 years. Miss Rachel had climbed upon my knees and pulled my whiskers many and many a time when she was a child. Miss Rachel, with all her faults, had been, to my mind, the dearest and prettiest and best young mistress that ever an old servant waited on and loved. I beg Sergeant Cuff's pardon, but I am afraid I did it with watery eyes, and not in a very becoming way. "Don't distress yourself, Mr. Betteredge," says the sergeant, with more kindness than I had any right to expect from him. "In my line of life, if we were quick at taking offence, we wouldn't be worth salt to our porridge. If it's any comfort to you, collar me again. You don't in the least know how to do it, but I'll overlook your awkwardness in consideration of your feelings." He curled up at the corners of his lips, and in his own dreary way seemed to think he had delivered himself of a very good joke. I led him into my own little sitting room and closed the door. "Tell me the truth, Sergeant," I said. "What do you suspect? It's no kindness to hide it from me now." "I don't suspect," said Sergeant Cuff. "I know." My unlucky temper began to get the better of me again. "Do you mean to tell me, in plain English," I said, "that Miss Rachel has stolen her own diamond?" "Yes," says the sergeant, "that is what I mean to tell you, in so many words. Miss Verinder has been in secret possession of the Moonstone from first to last, and she has taken Rosanna Spearman into her confidence, because she has calculated on our suspecting Rosanna Spearman of the theft. There is the whole case in a nutshell. Collar me again, Mr. Betteredge. If it's any vent to your feelings, collar me again." God help me! My feelings were not to be relieved in that way. "Give me your reasons." That was all I could say to him. "You shall hear my reasons to morrow," said the sergeant. "If Miss Verinder refuses to put off her visit to her aunt, which you will find Miss Verinder will do, I shall be obliged to lay the whole case before your mistress to morrow. And, as I don't know what may come of it, I shall request you to be present, and to hear what passes on both sides. Let the matter rest for to night. No, Mr. Betteredge, you don't get a word more on the subject of the Moonstone out of me. There is your table spread for supper. That's one of the many human infirmities which I always treat tenderly. If you will ring the bell, I'll say grace. For what we are about to receive—" "I wish you a good appetite to it, sergeant," I said. "My appetite is gone. I'll wait and see you served, and then I'll ask you to excuse me if I go away, and try to get the better of this by myself." I saw him served with the best of everything, and I shouldn't have been sorry if the best of everything had choked him. The head gardener, Mr. Begbie, came in at that time with his weekly account. The sergeant got on the subject of roses and the merits of grass walks and gravel walks immediately. I left the two together, and went out with a heavy heart. This was the first trouble I remember for many a long year which wasn't to be blown off by a whiff of tobacco, and which was even beyond the reach of Robinson Crusoe. Being restless and miserable, and having no particular room to go to, I took a turn on the terrace, and thought it over in peace and quietness by myself. It doesn't much matter what my thoughts were. I felt wretchedly old and worn out, and unfit for my place, and began to wonder, for the first time in my life, when it would please God to take me. With all this I held firm, notwithstanding, to my belief in Miss Rachel. If Sergeant Cuff had been Solomon in all his glory, and had told me that my young lady had mixed herself up in a mean and guilty plot, I should have had but one answer for Solomon, wise as he was: "You don't know her, and I do." My meditations were interrupted by Samuel. He brought me a written message from my mistress. Going into the house to get a light to read it by, Samuel remarked that there seemed a change coming in the weather. My troubled mind had prevented me from noticing it before, but, now my attention was roused, I heard the dogs uneasy, and the wind moaning low. Looking up at the sky, I saw the rack of clouds getting blacker and blacker, and hurrying faster and faster over a watery moon. Wild weather coming. Samuel was right. Wild weather coming. The message from my lady informed me that the magistrate at Frizinghall had written to remind her about the 3 Indians. Early in the coming week the rogues must needs be released, and left free to follow their own devices. If we had any more questions to ask them, there was no time to lose. Having forgotten to mention this when she had last seen Sergeant Cuff, my mistress now desired me to supply the omission. The Indians had gone clean out of my head, as they have, no doubt, gone clean out of yours. I didn't see much use in stirring that subject again. However, I obeyed my orders on the spot, as a matter of course. I found Sergeant Cuff and the gardener with a bottle of Scotch whisky between them, head over ears in an argument on the growing of roses. The sergeant was so deeply interested that he held up his hand and signed to me not to interrupt the discussion when I came in. As far as I could understand it, the question between them was, whether the white moss rose did, or did not, require to be budded on the dog roads to make it grow well. Mr. Begbie said yes, and Sergeant Cuff said no. They appealed to me as hotly as a couple of boys. Knowing nothing whatever about the growing of roses, I steered a middle course, just as Her Majesty's judges do when the scales of justice bother them by hanging even to a hair. "Gentlemen," I remarked, "there is much to be said on both sides." In the temporary lull produced by that impartial sentence, I laid my lady's written message on the table, under the eyes of Sergeant Cuff. I had got by this time, as nearly as might be, to hate the sergeant, but truth compels me to acknowledge that, in respect of readiness of mind, he was a wonderful man. In half a minute after he had read the message, he had looked back into his memory for Superintendent Seagrave's report, had picked out that part of it in which the Indians were concerned, and was ready with his answer. A certain great traveller, who understood the Indians and their language, had figured in Mr. Seagrave's report, hadn't he? Very well. Did I know the gentleman's name and address? Very well again. Would I write them on the back of my lady's message? Much obliged to me. Sergeant Cuff would look that gentleman up when he went to Frizinghall in the morning. Do you expect anything to come of it? I asked. Superintendent Seagrave found the Indians as innocent as the babe unborn. Superintendent Seagrave has been proved wrong up to this time in all his conclusions, answered the sergeant. It may be worthwhile to find out tomorrow whether Superintendent Seagrave was wrong about the Indians as well. With that he turned to Mr. Begbie, and took up the argument again, exactly at the place where it had left off. This question between us is a question of soils and seasons, and patience and pains, Mr. Gardner. Now let me put it to you from another point of view. You take your white moss rose. By that time I had closed the door on them, and was out of hearing of the rest of the dispute. In the passage I met Penelope hanging about, and asked what she was waiting for. She was waiting for her young lady's bell, when her young lady chose to call her back to go on with the packing for the next day's journey. Further inquiry revealed to me that Miss Rachel had given it as a reason for wanting to go to her aunt in Frizinghall that the house was unendurable to her, that she could bear the odious presence of a policeman under the same roof with herself no longer. On being informed half an hour since that her departure would be delayed until 2 in the afternoon, she had flown into a violent passion. My lady, present at the time, had severely rebuked her, and then, having apparently something to say which was reserved for her daughter's private ear, had sent Penelope out of the room. My girl was in wretchedly low spirits about the changed state of things in the house. Nothing goes right, father. Nothing is like what it used to be. I feel as if some dreadful misfortune was hanging over us all. That was my feeling too, but I put a good face on it before my daughter. Miss Rachel's bell rang while we were talking. Penelope ran up the back stairs to go on with the packing. I went by the other way to the hall, to see what the glass said about the change in the weather. Just as I approached the swing door leading into the hall from the servants' offices, it was violently opened from the other side, and Rosanna Spearman ran by me with a miserable look of pain in her face, and one of her hands pressed hard over her heart, as if the pang was in that quarter. "What's the matter, my girl?" I asked, stopping her. "Are you ill?" "For God's sake, don't speak to me!" she answered, and twisted herself out of my hands, and ran on towards the servants' staircase. I called to the cook, who was within hearing, to look after the poor girl. 2 other persons proved to be within hearing, as well as the cook. Sergeant Cuff darted softly out of my room, and asked what was the matter. I answered, "Nothing." Mr. Franklin, on the other side, pulled open the swing door, and beckoning me into the hall, inquired if I had seen anything of Rosanna Spearman. "She has just passed me, sir, with a very disturbed face, and in a very odd manner." "I am afraid I am innocently the cause of that disturbance, Betteredge." "You, sir? I can't explain it," says Mr. Franklin, "but, if the girl is concerned in the loss of the diamond, I do really believe she was on the point of confessing everything to me, of all the people in the world, not 2 minutes since." Looking towards the swing door as he said those last words, I fancied I saw it opened a little way from the inner side. Was there anybody listening? The door fell to before I could get to it. Looking through the moment after, I thought I saw the tails of Sergeant Cuff's respectable black coat disappearing round the corner of the passage. He knew, as well as I did, that he could expect no more help from me, now that I had discovered the turn in which his investigations were really taking. Under those circumstances it was quite in his character to help himself, and to do it by the underground way. Not feeling sure that I had really seen the sergeant, and not desiring to make needless mischief where, heaven knows, there was mischief enough already going on, I told Mr. Franklin that I thought one of the dogs had got into the house, and then begged him to describe what had happened between Rosanna and himself. "Were you passing through the hall, sir?" I asked. "Did you meet her accidentally when she spoke to you?" Mr. Franklin pointed to the billiard table. "I was knocking the balls about," he said, "and trying to get this miserable business of the diamond out of my mind. I happened to look up, and there stood Rosanna Spearman at the side of me, like a ghost. Her stealing on me in that way was so strange that I hardly knew what to do at first. Seeing a very anxious expression in her face, I asked her if she wished to speak to me. She answered, 'Yes, if I dare.' Knowing what suspicion attached to her, I could only put one construction on such language as that. I confess it made me uncomfortable. I had no wish to invite the girl's confidence. At the same time, in the difficulties that now beset us, I could hardly feel justified in refusing to listen to her, if she was really bent on speaking to me. It was an awkward position, and I dare say I got out of it awkwardly enough. I said to her, I don't quite understand you. Is there anything you want me to do?" "Mind, Betteredge, I didn't speak unkindly. The poor girl can't help being ugly. I felt that at the time. The cue was still in my hand, and I went on knocking the balls about, to take off the awkwardness of the thing. As it turned out, I only made matters worse still. I'm afraid I mortified her without meaning it. She suddenly turned away. 'He looks at the billiard balls,' I heard her say. 'Anything rather than look at me.' Before I could stop her, she had left the hall. I am not quite easy about it, Betteredge. Would you mind telling Rosanna that I meant no unkindness? I have been a little hard on her, perhaps, in my own thoughts. I have almost hoped that the loss of the diamond might be traced to her. Not from any ill will to the poor girl, but—" He stopped there, and going back to the billiard table, began to knock the balls about once more. After what had passed between the sergeant and me, I knew what it was that he had left unspoken, as well as he knew it himself. Nothing but the tracing of the Moonstone to our second housemaid could now raise Miss Rachel above the infamous suspicion that rested on her in the mind of Sergeant Cuff. It was no longer a question of quieting my young lady's nervous excitement. It was a question of proving her innocence. If Rosanna had done nothing to compromise herself, the hope which Mr. Franklin confessed to having felt would have been hard enough on her in all conscience. But this was not the case. She had pretended to be ill, and had gone secretly to Frizinghall. She had been up all night, making something or destroying something, in private. And she had been at the Shivering Sand that evening, under circumstances which were highly suspicious, to say the least of them. For all these reasons, sorry as I was for Rosanna, I could not but think that Mr. Franklin's way of looking at the matter was neither unnatural nor unreasonable, in Mr. Franklin's position. I said a word to him to that effect. "Yes, yes," he said in return, "but there is just a chance, a very poor one, certainly, that Rosanna's conduct may admit of some explanation which we don't see at present. I hate hurting a woman's feelings, Betteredge. Tell the poor creature what I told you to tell her, and if she wants to speak to me, I don't care whether I get into a scrape or not, send her to me in the library." With those kind words he laid down the cue and left me. Inquiry at the servants' offices informed me that Rosanna had retired to her own room. She had declined all offers of assistance with thanks, and had only asked to be left to rest in quiet. Here, therefore, was an end of any confession on her part, supposing she really had a confession to make, for that night. I reported the result to Mr. Franklin, who thereupon left the library and went up to bed. I was putting the lights out and making the windows fast when Samuel came in with news of the 2 guests whom I had left in my room. The argument about the white moss rose had apparently come to an end at last. The gardener had gone home, and Sergeant Cuff was nowhere to be found in the lower regions of the house. I looked into my room. Quite true, nothing was to be discovered there but a couple of empty tumblers and a strong smell of hot grog. Had the sergeant gone of his own accord to the bedchamber that was prepared for him? I went upstairs to see. After reaching the second landing, I thought I heard a sound of quiet and regular breathing on my left-hand side. My left-hand side led to the corridor which communicated with Miss Rachel's room. I looked in, and there, coiled up on 3 chairs placed right across the passage there, with a red handkerchief tied round his grizzled head, and his respectable black coat rolled up for a pillow, lay and slept Sergeant Cuff. He woke instantly and quietly, like a dog, the moment I approached him. "Good night, Mr. Betteredge," he said, "and mind, if you ever take to growing roses, the white moss rose is all the better for not being budded on the dog rose, whatever the gardener may say to the contrary." "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Why are you not in your proper bed?" "I am not in my proper bed," answered the sergeant, "because I am one of the many people in this miserable world who can't earn their money honestly and easily at the same time. There was a coincidence this evening between the period of Rosanna Spearman's return from the sands and the period when Miss Verinder stated her resolution to leave the house. Whatever Rosanna may have hidden, it's clear to my mind that your young lady couldn't go away until she knew it was hidden. The 2 must have communicated privately once already to-night. If they try to communicate again, when the house is quiet, I want to be in their way and stop it. Don't blame me for upsetting your sleeping arrangements, Mr. Betteredge. Blame the diamond." "I wish to God the diamond had never found its way into this house," I broke out. Sergeant Cuff looked with a rueful face at the 3 chairs on which he had condemned himself to pass the night. "So do I," he said gravely. Chapter 16. The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 17. Nothing happened in the night, and, I am happy to add, no attempt at communication between Miss Rachel and Rosanna rewarded the vigilance of Sergeant Cuff. I had expected the sergeant to set off for Frizinghall the first thing in the morning. He waited about, however, as if he had something else to do first. I left him to his own devices, and going into the grounds shortly after, met Mr. Franklin on his favourite walk by the shrubbery side. Before we had exchanged 2 words, the sergeant unexpectedly joined us. He made up to Mr. Franklin, who received him, I must own, haughtily enough. "Have you anything to say to me?" was all the return he got for politely wishing Mr. Franklin good morning. "I have something to say to you, sir," answered the sergeant, "on the subject of the inquiry I am conducting here. You detected the turn that inquiry was really taking yesterday. Naturally enough, in your position, you are shocked and distressed. Naturally enough, also, you visit your own angry sense of your own family scandal upon me." "What do you want?" Mr. Franklin broke in, sharply enough. "I want to remind you, sir, that I have at any rate thus far not been proved to be wrong. Bearing that in mind, be pleased to remember, at the same time, that I am an officer of the law, acting here under the sanction of the mistress of the house. Under these circumstances, is it, or is it not, your duty as a good citizen to assist me with any special information you may happen to possess?" "I possess no special information," says Mr. Franklin. Sergeant Cuff put that answer by him, as if no answer had been made. "You may save my time, sir, from being wasted on an inquiry at a distance," he went on, "if you choose to understand me and speak out." "I don't understand you," answered Mr. Franklin, "and I have nothing to say." "One of the female servants, I won't mention names, spoke to you privately, sir, last night." Once more Mr. Franklin cut him short. Once more Mr. Franklin answered, "I have nothing to say." Standing by in silence, I thought of the movement in the swing door on the previous evening, and of the coat tails which I had seen disappearing down the passage. Sergeant Cuff had, no doubt, just heard enough before I interrupted him to make him suspect that Rosanna had relieved her mind by confessing something to Mr. Franklin Blake. This notion had barely struck me when who should appear at the end of the shrubbery walk but Rosanna Spearman in her own proper person. She was followed by Penelope, who was evidently trying to make her retrace her steps to the house. Seeing that Mr. Franklin was not alone, Rosanna came to a standstill, evidently in great perplexity what to do next. Penelope waited behind her. Mr. Franklin saw the girls as soon as I saw them. The sergeant, with his devilish cunning, took on not to have noticed them at all. All this happened in an instant. Before either Mr. Franklin or I could say a word, Sergeant Cuff struck in smoothly, with an appearance of continuing the previous conversation. "You needn't be afraid of harming the girl, sir," he said to Mr. Franklin, speaking in a loud voice so that Rosanna might hear him. "On the contrary, I recommend you to honour me with your confidence if you feel any interest in Rosanna Spearman." Mr. Franklin instantly took on not to have noticed the girls either. He answered, speaking loudly on his side, "I take no interest whatever in Rosanna Spearman." I looked towards the end of the walk. All I saw at the distance was that Rosanna suddenly turned round the moment Mr. Franklin had spoken. Instead of resisting Penelope as she had done the moment before, she now let my daughter take her by the arm and lead her back to the house. The breakfast bell rang as the 2 girls disappeared, and even Sergeant Cuff was now obliged to give it up as a bad job. He said to me quietly, "I shall go to Frizinghall, Mr. Betteredge, and I shall be back before 2." He went his way without a word more, and for some few hours we were well rid of him. "You must make it right with Rosanna," Mr. Franklin said to me when we were alone. "I seem to be fated to say or do something awkward before that unlucky girl. You must have seen yourself that Sergeant Cuff laid a trap for both of us. If he could confuse me, or irritate her into breaking out, either she or I might have said something which would answer his purpose. On the spur of the moment I saw no better way out of it than the way I took. It stopped the girl from saying anything, and it showed the sergeant that I saw through him. He was evidently listening, Betteredge, when I was speaking to you last night." He had done worse than listen, as I privately thought to myself. He had remembered my telling him that the girl was in love with Mr. Franklin, and he had calculated on that when he appealed to Mr. Franklin's interest in Rosanna, in Rosanna's hearing. "As to listening, sir," I remarked, keeping the other point to myself, "we shall all be rowing in the same boat if this sort of thing goes on much longer. Prying and peeping and listening are the natural occupations of people situated as we are. In another day or 2, Mr. Franklin, we shall all be struck dumb together, for this reason, that we shall all be listening to surprise each other's secrets, and all know it. Excuse my breaking out, sir. The horrid mystery hanging over us in this house gets into my head like liquor, and makes me wild. I won't forget what you have told me. I'll take the first opportunity of making it right with Rosanna Spearman." "You haven't said anything to her yet about last night, have you?" Mr. Franklin asked. "No, sir." "Then say nothing now. I had better not invite the girl's confidence, with the sergeant on the lookout to surprise us together. My conduct is not very consistent, Betteredge, is it? I see no way out of this business, which isn't dreadful to think of, unless the diamond is traced to Rosanna, and yet I can't, and won't, help Sergeant Cuff to find the girl out." Unreasonable enough, no doubt, but it was my state of mind as well. I thoroughly understood him. If you will, for once in your life, remember that you are mortal, perhaps you will thoroughly understand him too. The state of things, indoors and out, while Sergeant Cuff was on his way to Frizinghall, was briefly this. Miss Rachel waited for the time when the carriage was to take her to her aunt's, still obstinately shut up in her own room. My lady and Mr. Franklin breakfasted together. After breakfast, Mr. Franklin took one of his sudden resolutions, and went out precipitately to quiet his mind by a long walk. I was the only person who saw him go, and he told me he should be back before the sergeant returned. The change in the weather, foreshadowed overnight, had come. Heavy rain had been followed soon after dawn by high wind. It was blowing fresh as the day got on. But though the clouds threatened more than once, the rain still held off. It was not a bad day for a walk if you were young and strong, and could breast the great gusts of wind which came sweeping in from the sea. I attended my lady after breakfast, and assisted her in the settlement of her household accounts. She only once alluded to the matter of the Moonstone, and that was in the way of forbidding any present mention of it between us. "Wait until that man comes back," she said, meaning the sergeant. "We must speak of it then. We are not obliged to speak of it now." After leaving my mistress, I found Penelope waiting for me in my room. "I wish, father, you would come and speak to Rosanna," she said. "I am very uneasy about her." I suspected what was the matter readily enough, but it is a maxim of mine that men, being superior creatures, are bound to improve women if they can. When a woman wants me to do anything, my daughter or not, it doesn't matter, I always insist on knowing why. The oftener you make them rummage in their own minds for a reason, the more manageable you will find them in all the relations of life. It isn't their fault, poor wretches, that they act first and think afterwards. It is the fault of the fools who humour them. Penelope's reason why on this occasion may be given in her own words. "I am afraid, father," she said, "Mr. Franklin has hurt Rosanna cruelly without intending it." "What took Rosanna into the shrubbery walk?" I asked. "Her own madness," says Penelope. "I can call it nothing else. She was bent on speaking to Mr. Franklin this morning, come what might of it. I did my best to stop her, you saw that. If I could only have got her away before she heard those dreadful words." "There, there," I said, "don't lose your head. I can't call to mind that anything happened to alarm Rosanna." "Nothing to alarm her, father, but Mr. Franklin said he took no interest whatever in her, and oh, he said it in such a cruel voice." "He said it to stop the sergeant's mouth," I answered. "I told her that," says Penelope, "but you see, father, though Mr. Franklin isn't to blame, he's been mortifying and disappointing her for weeks and weeks past, and now this comes on the top of it all. She has no right, of course, to expect him to take any interest in her. It's quite monstrous that she should forget herself and her station in that way. But she seems to have lost pride and proper feeling and everything. She frightened me, father, when Mr. Franklin said those words. They seemed to turn her into stone. A sudden quiet came over her, and she has gone about her work ever since, like a woman in a dream." I began to feel a little uneasy. There was something in the way Penelope put it which silenced my superior sense. I called to mind, now my thoughts were directed that way, what had passed between Mr. Franklin and Rosanna overnight. She looked cut to the heart on that occasion, and now, as ill luck would have it, she had been unavoidably stung again, poor soul, on the tender place. Sad, sad, all the more sad because the girl had no reason to justify her and no right to feel it. I had promised Mr. Franklin to speak to Rosanna, and this seemed the fittest time for keeping my word. We found the girl sweeping the corridor outside the bedrooms, pale and composed, and neat as ever in her modest print dress. I noticed a curious dimness and dullness in her eyes, not as if she had been crying, but as if she had been looking at something too long. Possibly it was a misty something raised by her own thoughts. There was certainly no object about her to look at which she had not seen already hundreds on hundreds of times. "Cheer up, Rosanna," I said. "You mustn't fret over your fancies. I have got something to say to you from Mr. Franklin." I thereupon put the matter in the right view before her, in the friendliest and most comforting words I could find. My principles in regard to the other sex are, as you may have noticed, very severe. But somehow or other, when I come face to face with the women, my practice, I own, is not conformable. "Mr. Franklin is very kind and considerate. Please to thank him." That was all the answer she made me. My daughter had already noticed that Rosanna went about her work like a woman in a dream. I now added to this observation that she also listened and spoke like a woman in a dream. I doubted if her mind was in a fit condition to take in what I had said to her. "Are you quite sure, Rosanna, that you understand me?" I asked. "Quite sure." She echoed me, not like a living woman, but like a creature moved by machinery. She went on sweeping all the time. I took away the broom as gently and as kindly as I could. "Come, come, my girl," I said. "This is not like yourself. You have got something on your mind. I'm your friend, and I'll stand your friend, even if you have done wrong. Make a clean breast of it, Rosanna. Make a clean breast of it." The time had been when my speaking to her in that way would have brought the tears into her eyes. I could see no change in them now. "Yes," she said, "I'll make a clean breast of it." "To my lady?" I asked. "No, to Mr. Franklin." "To Mr. Franklin?" "Yes, to Mr. Franklin." I hardly knew what to say to that. She was in no condition to understand the caution against speaking to him in private, which Mr. Franklin had directed me to give her. Feeling my way, little by little, I only told her Mr. Franklin had gone out for a walk. "It doesn't matter," she answered. "I shan't trouble Mr. Franklin to-day." "Why not speak to my lady?" I said. "The way to relieve your mind is to speak to the merciful and Christian mistress who has always been kind to you." She looked at me for a moment with a grave and steady attention, as if she was fixing what I had said in her mind. Then she took the broom out of my hands and moved off with it slowly a little way down the corridor. "No," she said, going on with her sweeping, and speaking to herself. "I know a better way of relieving my mind than that." "What is it?" "Please to let me go on with my work." Penelope followed her and offered to help her. She answered, "No, I want to do my work. Thank you, Penelope." She looked round at me. "Thank you, Mr. Betteredge." There was no moving her. There was nothing more to be said. I signed to Penelope to come away with me. We left her, as we had found her, sweeping the corridor like a woman in a dream. "This is a matter for the doctor to look into," I said. "It's beyond me." My daughter reminded me of Mr. Candy's illness, owing, as you may remember, to the chill he had caught on the night of the dinner party. His assistant, a certain Mr. Ezra Jennings, was at our disposal, to be sure, but nobody knew much about him in our parts. He had been engaged by Mr. Candy under rather peculiar circumstances, and right or wrong we none of us liked him or trusted him. There were other doctors at Frizinghall, but they were strangers to our house, and Penelope doubted in Rosanna's present state whether strangers might not do her more harm than good. I thought of speaking to my lady, but remembering the heavy weight of anxiety which she already had on her mind, I hesitated to add to all the other vexations this new trouble. Still, there was a necessity for doing something. The girl's state was to my thinking downright alarming, and my mistress ought to be informed of it. Unwillingly enough I went to her sitting room. No one was there. My lady was shut up with Miss Rachel. It was impossible for me to see her till she came out again. I waited in vain till the clock on the front staircase struck the 1:45. 5 minutes afterwards I heard my name called from the drive outside the house. I knew the voice directly. Sergeant Cuff had returned from Frizinghall. End of chapter 17.
The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins. Read by Leanne Howlett. Chapter 18. Going down to the front door, I met the sergeant on the steps. It went against the grain with me, after what had passed between us, to show him that I felt any sort of interest in his proceedings. In spite of myself, however, I felt an interest that there was no resisting. My sense of dignity sank from under me, and out came the words, "What news from Frizinghall?" "I have seen the Indians," answered Sergeant Cuff, "and I have found out what Rosanna bought privately in the town on Thursday last. The Indians will be set free on Wednesday in next week. There isn't a doubt on my mind, and there isn't a doubt on Mr. Murthwaite's mind, that they came to this place to steal the Moonstone. Their calculations were all thrown out, of course, by what happened in the house on Wednesday night, and they have no more to do with the actual loss of the jewel than you have. But I can tell you one thing, Mr. Betteredge, if we don't find the Moonstone, they will. You have not heard the last of the 3 jugglers yet." Mr. Franklin came back from his walk as the sergeant said those startling words. Governing his curiosity better than I had governed mine, he passed us without a word, and went on into the house. As for me, having already dropped my dignity, I determined to have the whole benefit of the sacrifice. "So much for the Indians," I said. "What about Rosanna next?" Sergeant Cuff shook his head. "The mystery in that quarter is thicker than ever," he said. "I have traced her to a shop at Frizzing Hall, kept by a linen draper named Maltby. She bought nothing whatever at any of the other drapers' shops, or at any milliner's or tailor's shops, and she bought nothing at Maltby's but a piece of long cloth. She was very particular in choosing a certain quality. As to quantity, she bought enough to make a nightgown." "Whose nightgown?" I asked. "Her own, to be sure. Between 12 and 3 on the Thursday morning she must have slipped down to your young lady's room to settle the hiding of the Moonstone while all the rest of you were in bed. In going back to her own room her nightgown must have brushed the wet paint on the door. She couldn't wash out the stain, and she couldn't safely destroy the nightgown without first providing another like it, to make the inventory of her linen complete." "What proves that it was Rosanna's nightgown?" I objected. "The material she bought for making the substitute dress," answered the sergeant. "If it had been Miss Verander's nightgown, she would have had to buy lace and frilling and Lord knows what besides, and she wouldn't have had time to make it in one night. Plain long cloth means a plain servant's nightgown. No, no, Mr. Betteredge, all that is clear enough. The pinch of the question is, why, after having provided the substitute dress, does she hide the smeared nightgown instead of destroying it? If the girl won't speak out, there is only one way of settling the difficulty. The hiding place at the Shivering Sand must be searched, and the true state of the case will be discovered there." "How are you to find the place?" I inquired. "I am sorry to disappoint you," said the sergeant, "but that's a secret which I mean to keep to myself." Not to irritate your curiosity, as he irritated mine, I may here inform you that he had come back from Frizzing Hall provided with a search warrant. His experience in such matters told him that Rosanna was in all probability carrying about her a memorandum of the hiding place to guide her in case she returned to it under changed circumstances and after a lapse of time. Possessed of this memorandum, the sergeant would be furnished with all that he could desire. "Now, Mr. Betteredge," he went on, "suppose we drop speculation and get to business. I told Joyce to have an eye on Rosanna. Where is Joyce?" Joyce was the Frizzing Hall policeman who had been left by Superintendent Seagrave at Sergeant Cuff's disposal. The clock struck 2 as he put the question, and punctual to the moment the carriage came round to take Miss Rachel to her aunt's. "One thing at a time," said the sergeant, stopping me as I was about to send in search of Joyce. "I must attend to Miss Verinder first." As the rain was still threatening, it was the closed carriage that had been appointed to take Miss Rachel to Frizzing Hall. Sergeant Cuff beckoned Samuel to come down to him from the rumble behind. "You will see a friend of mine waiting among the trees on this side of the lodge gate," he said. "My friend, without stopping the carriage, will get up onto the rumble with you. You have nothing to do but to hold your tongue and shut your eyes, otherwise you will get into trouble." With that advice he sent the footman back to his place. What Samuel thought I don't know. It was plain to my mind that Miss Rachel was to be privately kept in view from the time when she left our house, if she did leave it. A watch set on my young lady, a spy behind her in the rumble of her mother's carriage. I could have cut my own tongue out for having forgotten myself so far as to speak to Sergeant Cuff. The first person to come out of the house was my lady. She stood aside on the top step, posting herself there to see what happened. Not a word did she say, either to the sergeant or to me. With her lips closed and her arms folded in the light garden cloak which she had wrapped round her on coming into the air, there she stood, as still as a statue, waiting for her daughter to appear. In a minute more Miss Rachel came downstairs, very nicely dressed in some soft yellow stuff that set off her dark complexion and clipped her tight, in the form of a jacket, round the waist. She had a smart little straw hat on her head with a white veil twisted round it. She had primrose-colored gloves that fitted her hands like a second skin. Her beautiful black hair looked as smooth as satin under her hat. Her little ears were like rosy shells. They had a pearl dangling from each of them. She came swiftly out to us, as straight as a lily on its stem, and as lithe and supple in every movement she made as a young cat. Nothing that I could discover was altered in her pretty face but her eyes and her lips. Her eyes were brighter and fiercer than I liked to see, and her lips had so completely lost their color in their smile that I hardly knew them again. She kissed her mother in a hasty and sudden manner on the cheek. She said, "Try to forgive me, mamma," and then pulled down her veil over her face so vehemently that she tore it. In another moment she had run down the steps and had rushed into the carriage as if it was a hiding-place. Sergeant Cuff was just as quick on his side. He put Samuel back and stood before Miss Rachel, with the open carriage door in his hand, at the instant when she settled herself in her place. "What do you want?" says Miss Rachel from behind her veil. "I want to say one word to you, miss," answered the sergeant, "before you go. I can't presume to stop your paying a visit to your aunt. I can only venture to say that your leaving us, as things are now, puts an obstacle in the way of my recovering your diamond. Please to understand that, and now decide for yourself whether you go or stay." Miss Rachel never even answered him. "Drive on, James," she called out to the coachman. Without another word the sergeant shut the carriage door. Just as he closed it, Mr. Franklin came running down the steps. "Good-bye, Rachel," he said, holding out his hand. "Drive on," cried Miss Rachel louder than ever, and taking no more notice of Mr. Franklin than she had taken of Sergeant Cuff. Mr. Franklin stepped back thunderstruck, as well he might be. The coachman, not knowing what to do, looked towards my lady, still standing immovable on the top step. My lady, with anger and sorrow and shame all struggling together in her face, made him a sign to start the horses, and then turned back hastily into the house. Mr. Franklin, recovering the use of his speech, called after her as the carriage drove off. "Aunt, you were quite right. Accept my thanks for all your kindness, and let me go." My lady turned as though to speak to him. Then, as if distrusting herself, waved her hand kindly. "Let me see you before you leave us, Franklin," she said, in a broken voice, and went on to her own room. "Do me a last favour, Betteredge," says Mr. Franklin, turning to me with the tears in his eyes. "Get me away to the train as soon as you can." He, too, went his way into the house. For the moment Miss Rachel had completely unmanned him. Judge from that how fond he must have been of her. Sergeant Cuff and I were left face to face at the bottom of the steps. The sergeant stood with his face set towards a gap in the trees, commanding a view of one of the windings of the drive which led from the house. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was softly whistling "The Last Rose of Summer" to himself. "There's a time for everything," I said savagely enough. "This isn't a time for whistling." At that moment the carriage appeared in the distance, through the gap, on its way to the lodge gate. There was another man besides Samuel, plainly visible in the rumble behind. "All right," said the sergeant to himself. He turned round to me. "It's no time for whistling, Mr. Betteredge, as you say. It's time to take this business in hand now without sparing anybody. We'll begin with Rosanna Spearman. Where is Joyce?" We both called for Joyce and received no answer. I sent one of the stable boys to look for him. "You heard what I said to Miss Verinder," remarked the sergeant, while we were waiting, "and you saw how she received it. I tell her plainly that her leaving us will be an obstacle in the way of my recovering her diamond, and she leaves, in the face of that statement. Your young lady has got a travelling companion in her mother's carriage, Mr. Betteredge, and the name of it is the Moonstone." I said nothing. I only held on like death to my belief in Miss Rachel. The stable boy came back, followed, very unwillingly, as it appeared to me, by Joyce. "Where is Rosanna Spearman?" asked Sergeant Cuff. "I can't account for it, sir," Joyce began, "and I am very sorry, but somehow or other—" "Before I went to Frizzing Hall," said the sergeant, cutting him short, "I told you to keep your eyes on Rosanna Spearman, without allowing her to discover that she was being watched. Do you mean to tell me that you have let her give you the slip?" "I am afraid, sir," says Joyce, beginning to tremble, "that I was perhaps a little too careful not to let her discover me. There are such a many passages in the lower parts of this house. How long is it since you missed her?" "Nigh on an hour since, sir." "You can go back to your regular business at Frizzing Hall," said the sergeant, speaking just as composedly as ever, in his usual quiet and dreary way. "I don't think your talents are at all in our line, Mr. Joyce. Your present form of employment is a trifle beyond you. Good morning." The man slunk off. I find it very difficult to describe how I was affected by the discovery that Rosanna Spearman was missing. I seemed to be in 50 different minds about it, all at the same time. In that state I stood staring at Sergeant Cuff, and my powers of language quite failed me. "No, Mr. Betteredge," said the sergeant, as if he had discovered the uppermost thought in me, and was picking it out to be answered before all the rest. "Your young friend Rosanna won't slip through my fingers so easy as you think. As long as I know where Miss Verinder is, I have the means at my disposal of tracing Miss Verinder's accomplice. I prevented them from communicating last night. Very good. They will get together at Frizzing Hall instead of getting together here. The present inquiry must be simply shifted, rather sooner than I had anticipated, from this house to the house at which Miss Verinder is visiting. In the meantime, I'm afraid I must trouble you to call the servants together again." I went round with him to the servants' hall. It is very disgraceful, but it is not the less true, that I had another attack of the detective fever when he said those last words. I forgot that I hated Sergeant Cuff. I seized him confidentially by the arm. I said, "For goodness' sake, tell us what you are going to do with the servants now." The great Cuff stood stock still and addressed himself in a kind of melancholy rapture to the empty air. "If this man," said the sergeant, apparently meaning me, "only understood the growing of roses, he would be the most completely perfect character on the face of creation." After that strong expression of feeling he sighed, and put his arm through mine. "This is how it stands," he said, dropping down again to business. "Rosanna has done one of two things. She has either gone direct to Frizzing Hall, before I can get there, or she has gone first to visit her hiding place at the Shivering Sand. The first thing is to find out is, which of the servants saw the last of her before she left the house." On instituting this inquiry, it turned out that the last person who had set eyes on Rosanna was Nancy, the kitchen maid. Nancy had seen her slip out with a letter in her hand, and stop the butcher's man, who had just been delivering some meat at the back door. Nancy had heard her ask the man to post the letter when he got back to Frizzing Hall. The man had looked at the address, and had said it was a roundabout way of delivering a letter directed to Cobb's Hole, to post it at Frizzing Hall, and that, moreover, on a Saturday, which would prevent the letter from getting to its destination until Monday morning, Rosanna had answered that the delivery of the letter being delayed till Monday was of no importance. The only thing she wished to be sure of was that the man would do what she told him. The man had promised to do it, and had driven away. Nancy had been called back to her work in the kitchen, and no other person had seen anything afterwards of Rosanna Spearman. "Well?" I asked, when we were alone again. "Well," says the sergeant, "I must go to Frizzing Hall." "About the letter, sir?" "Yes. The memorandum of the hiding place is in that letter. I must see the address at the post office. If it is the address I suspect, I shall pay our friend Mrs. Yolland another visit on Monday next." I went with the sergeant to order the pony chaise. In the stable yard we got a new light thrown on the missing girl. Chapter 18. The Moonstone, by Wilkie Collins. Read by Leanne Howlett. Chapter 19. The news of Rosanna's disappearance had, as it appeared, spread among the out-of-door servants. They too had made their inquiries, and they had just laid hands on a quick little imp nicknamed Duffy, who was occasionally employed in weeding the garden, and who had seen Rosanna Spearman as lately as half an hour since. Duffy was certain that the girl had passed him in the fir plantation, not walking, but running, in the direction of the seashore. "Does this boy know the coast hereabouts?" asked Sergeant Cuff. "He has been born and bred on the coast," I answered. "Duffy," says the sergeant, "do you want to earn a shilling? If you do, come along with me. Keep the pony chaise ready, Mr. Betteredge, till I come back." He started for the Shivering Sand, at a rate that my legs, though well enough preserved for my time of life, had no hope of matching. Little Duffy, as the way is with the young savages in our parts when they are in high spirits, gave a howl, and trotted off at the sergeant's heels. Here again I find it impossible to give anything like a clear account of the state of my mind in the interval after Sergeant Cuff had left us. A curious and stupefying restlessness got possession of me. I did a dozen different needless things in and out of the house, not one of which I can now remember. I don't even know how long it was after the sergeant had gone to the sands, when Duffy came running back with a message for me. Sergeant Cuff had given the boy a leaf torn out of his pocket-book, on which was written in pencil, "Send me one of Rosanna Spearman's boots, and be quick about it." I dispatched the first woman servant I could find to Rosanna's room, and I sent the boy back to say that I myself would follow him with the boot. This, I am well aware, was not the quickest way to take of obeying the directions which I had received, but I was resolved to see for myself what new mystification was going on before I trusted Rosanna's boot in the sergeant's hands. My old notion of screening the girl, if I could, seemed to have come back on me again at the 11th hour. This state of feeling, to say nothing of the detective fever, hurried me off, as soon as I got the boot, at the nearest approach to a run which a man turned 70 can reasonably hope to make. As I got near the shore the clouds gathered black and the rain came down, drifting in great white sheets of water before the wind. I heard the thunder of the sea on the sandbank at the mouth of the bay. A little further on I passed the boy, crouching for shelter under the lee of the sand-hills. Then I saw the raging sea and the rollers tumbling in on the sandbank and the driven rain sweeping over the waters like a flying garment, and the yellow wilderness of the beach with one solitary black figure standing on it, the figure of Sergeant Cuff. He waved his hand towards the north when he first saw me. "Keep on that side," he shouted, "and come on down here to me." I went down to him, choking for breath, with my heart leaping as if it was like to leap out of me. I was past speaking. I had 100 questions to put to him, and not one of them would pass my lips. His face frightened me. I saw a look in his eyes which was a look of horror. He snatched the boot out of my hand and set it in a footmark on the sand, bearing south from us as we stood, and pointing straight towards the rocky ledge called the South Spit. The mark was not yet blurred out by the rain, and the girl's boot fitted it to a hair. The sergeant pointed to the boot and the footmark without saying a word. I caught at his arm and tried to speak to him, and failed as I had failed when I tried before. He went on, following the footsteps down and down to where the rocks and the sand joined. The South Spit was just awash with the flowing tide, the waters heaved over the hidden face of the shivering sand. Now this way and now that, with an obstinate patience that was dreadful to see, Sergeant Cuff tried the boot and the footsteps, and always found it pointing the same way, straight to the rocks. Hunt as he might, no sign could he find anywhere of the footsteps walking from them. He gave it up at last. Still keeping silence, he looked again at me, and then he looked out at the waters before us, heaving in deeper and deeper over the quicksand. I looked where he looked, and I saw his thought in his face. A dreadful dumb trembling crawled all over me on a sudden. I fell upon my knees on the beach. "She has been back at the hiding-place," I heard the sergeant say to himself. "Some fatal accident has happened to her on those rocks." The girl's altered looks and words and actions, the numbed, deadened way in which she listened to me and spoke to me, when I had found her sweeping the corridor but a few hours since, rose up in my mind, and warned me, even as the sergeant spoke, that his guess was wide of the dreadful truth. I tried to tell him of the fear that had frozen me up. I tried to say, "The death she has died, Sergeant, was a death of her own seeking." No, the words wouldn't come. The dumb trembling held me in its grip. I couldn't feel the driving rain. I couldn't see the rising tide. As in the vision of a dream, the poor lost creature came back before me. I saw her again as I had seen her in the past time, on the morning when I went to fetch her into the house. I heard her again, telling me that the shivering sand seemed to draw her to it against her will, and wondering whether her grave was waiting for her there. The horror of it struck at me, in some unfathomable way, through my own child. My girl was just her age. My girl, tried as Rosanna was tried, might have lived that miserable life, and died this dreadful death. The sergeant kindly lifted me up and turned me away from the side of the place where she had perished. With that relief I began to fetch my breath again and to see things about me as things really were. Looking towards the sand hills I saw the men servants from out of doors, and the fisherman, named Yolland, all running down to us together, and all, having taken the alarm, calling out to know if the girl had been found. In the fewest words the sergeant showed them the evidence of the footmarks, and told them that a fatal accident must have happened to her. He then picked out the fisherman from the rest, and put a question to him, turning about again towards the sea. "Tell me," he said, "could a boat have taken her off, in such weather as this, from those rocks where her footmarks stop?" The fisherman pointed to the rollers tumbling in on the sandbank, and to the great waves leaping up in clouds of foam against the headlands on either side of us. "No boat that ever was built," he answered, "could have got to her through that." Sergeant Cuff looked for the last time at the footmarks on the sand, which the rain was now fast blurring out. "There," he said, "is the evidence that she can't have left this place by land. And here," he went on, looking at the fisherman, "is the evidence that she can't have got away by sea." He stopped and considered for a minute. "She was seen running towards this place half an hour before I got here from the house," he said to Yolland. "Some time has passed since then. Call it altogether an hour ago. How high would the water be at that time on this side of the rocks?" He pointed to the south side otherwise, the side which was not filled up by the quicksand. "As the tide makes today," said the fisherman, "there wouldn't have been water enough to drown a kitten on that side of the spit an hour since." Sergeant Cuff turned about northward towards the quicksand. "How much on this side?" he asked. "Less still," answered Yolland. "The shivering sand would have been just awash, and no more." The sergeant turned to me and said that the accident must have happened on the side of the quicksand. My tongue was loosened at that. No accident, I told him. When she came to this place she came weary of her life to end it here. He started back from me. "How do you know?" he asked. The rest of them crowded round. The sergeant recovered himself instantly. He put them back from me. He said I was an old man. He said the discovery had shaken me. He said, "Let him alone a little." Then he turned to Yolland and asked, "Is there any chance of finding her when the tide ebbs again?" And Yolland answered, "None. What the sand gets the sand keeps for ever." Having said that, the fisherman came a step nearer and addressed himself to me. "Mr. Betteredge," he said, "I have a word to say to you about the young woman's death. 4 foot out, broadwise, along the side of the spit, there's a shelf of rock, about half fathom down under the sand. My question is, why didn't she strike that? If she slipped, by accident, from off the spit, she fell in where there's foothold at the bottom, at a depth that would barely cover her to the waist. She must have waded out or jumped out into the deeps beyond, or she wouldn't be missing now. No accident, sir. The deeps of the quicksand have got her, and they have got her by her own act." After that testimony from a man whose knowledge was to be relied on, the sergeant was silent. The rest of us, like him, held our peace. With one accord we all turned back up the slope of the beach. At the sand hillocks we were met by the undergroom, running to us from the house. The lad is a good lad, and has an honest respect for me. He handed me a little note, with a decent sorrow in his face. "Penelope sent me with this, Mr. Betteredge," he said. "She found it in Rosanna's room." It was her last farewell word to the old man who had done his best, thank God, always done his best, to befriend her. "You have often forgiven me, Mr. Betteredge, in past times. When you next see the shivering sand, try to forgive me once more. I have found my grave where my grave was waiting for me. I have lived and died, sir, grateful for your kindness." There was no more than that. Little as it was, I hadn't manhood enough to hold up against it. Your tears come easy when you're young, and beginning the world. Your tears come easy when you're old, and leaving it. I burst out crying. Sergeant Cuff took a step nearer to me, meaning kindly, I don't doubt. I shrank back from him. "Don't touch me," I said. "It's the dread of you that has driven her to it." "You are wrong, Mr. Betteredge," he answered quietly. "But there will be time enough to speak of it when we are indoors again." I followed the rest of them with the help of the groom's arm. Through the driving rain we went back to meet the trouble and the terror that were waiting for us at the house. End of Chapter 19.